Tacoma Park, Maryland, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., is one of the first planned Victorian-style suburbs. The perfect spot for an old-school romance to flourish.
I still got it. I swear, Cece, you gonna make me wait all night? Come on now.
Hold your horses, woman. Man, these pants so tight, you can see my religion.
Well, come over here, and I will show you my promised land.
Girl, you pretty as a peach.
I know.
After a 31-year relationship, Larlene Pinnell and Cecil Brown are finally getting married.
Yeah, let's get this over with.
When I first met him, he scared me to death. But over the years, he softened up. Cecil was very blunt. He said what he meant and meant what he said. He would do anything for anybody.
But Larlene is quite the opposite.
She played a lot. She laughed and joked a lot. Just fun to be around. My mother was cool.
The wedding is quick, quiet, and modest, as is the celebration that marks the end of their long affair.
You like it?
I do.
And a new beginning for an old relationship.
Oh.
Come on now.
Give me like that, huh?
Let's see.
You think I can?
Let's see then. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
You got moves.
Cecil and Larlene have been dancing together for years.
They used to go to dances all the time. They met at a dance. And my father had a fast car, and she liked fast cars, so they would ride around.
They may have acted like teenagers, but when they first met, 23-year-old Cecil was stuck in a stale marriage with 5 kids.
He had been married to someone else and had had children with that woman. She had sort of successfully lured him away.
Larlene gets to be the piece of cake that is forbidden, but you get to try it.
Their forbidden affair lasts 11 years before Cecil finally leaves his first wife and moves in with Larlene.
She's always doting on my dad. She called him Mr. B. Mr. B, did you want this? Do you want something to drink? Mr. B, are you hungry?
But what effect does this long affair have on Cecil and Larlene's relationship? Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell have some thoughts.
The fact that Cecil carries on an 11-year affair with Larlene before actually leaving his first wife and going to live with Larlene and their son is somewhat surprising to me. That whole time he must have been profoundly conflicted. He must have had very strong feelings, a very strong attachment to Larlene. At the same time, something obviously was keeping him anchored with his first wife, probably the fact, I would guess, that they had kids as well.
When he finally decides that he's going to leave his first relationship and move forward with Larlene, this could cause some trust issues for her. While at the same time, I'm sure she's happy that she finally has him all to herself, I think she also would be wondering, is he somebody who's capable of being with just one person? What's he going to be like to be with on a regular basis 100% of the time?
Larlene and Cecil have lived in Tacoma Park for over 20 years.
Don't forget to come in for lunch today, Mr. B.
We worked around the house because the house wasn't, it was in really bad shape, so it took us years to, get it together.
You can't stay out there all day.
Watch me.
I will find you. I know where you go.
Working around the yard, putting up a fence, painting the house.
Don't forget to fix the barbecue. We got people coming tomorrow.
There were black parties, there were barbecues in the backyard.
She was like the matriarch of the neighborhood. She was the go-to person.
And Cecil is her go-to man. He provides security and brings in good money as a heavy equipment operator. But he's completely reliant on Larlene for one thing.
That what I think it is?
Depends. What do you think it is?
Another bill?
My father couldn't read or write.
Oh, come on, just the first word.
Don't start with me, woman. You better be taking care of my money.
Mr. B, of course I'm taking care of our money.
That made him dependent upon Larlene in a great way. It was like he couldn't function without her doing the paperwork, the banking, the grocery shopping, to do a loan, to do a job application, to keep a schedule, to text on your phone would have been difficult for my dad. He didn't like being dependent upon anybody.
He couldn't read or write, but far from stupid. He was extremely smart, good on numbers, extremely good with money. I don't think my dad really trusted banks. He had told one of his friends that he had $300,000 in the safe. Yeah, he had money.
It's no small feat for a man whose education never progressed beyond grade 10. But when it comes to his teenage son, Cecil pushes him to do better.
My father was strict with me, I believe, because his mom was strict with him. And I think that's all he knew. So he just passed it on to me. He would always leave me things to do, assign me chores or a task. If I left the rake out, if I didn't sweep the driveway, if I didn't cut the grass, or if I cut the back and not the front, if I didn't do something that he told me to do, there was consequences behind that.
You got something to say to me?
Oh, I forgot. I was at school. I'm here now.
Well, what you don't forget is that you live here. And when you live here, you live up to your responsibilities. You got that?
Got it.
I don't think you do.
Get off me.
Not in my house, boy. I'm gonna teach you to be a man. And a man lives up to his responsibilities. Well, you got something to say to me now?
He was just an extremely hard disciplinarian. Borderline abusive. When my father would discipline me, she never jumped in and intervened. It was what it was.
As time passes, Cecil and Larlene's relationship begins to change.
They didn't do too much together. She would fuss because he wouldn't take her out to dinner. So as far as romantic things, no. No flowers, no taking out to dinner.
He worked hard and he was tight with his money. He didn't just spend it frivolously.
They were two completely different people. She spent money, he saved money. Night and day. Night and day.
You know, it's okay to have a little secret on the side.
Is the flame between Larlene and Cecil flickering out?
Why don't you just go your own way and just leave him where he's at?
Don't be passing it off, Cecil. This is your fault.
He wanted to not have to ask anybody for anything.
After a 31-year relationship, Cecil and Larlene Brown finally tie the knot. But once the glow of the ceremony wears off, Cecil's penny pinching takes its toll on Larlene.
she got a job and she started contributing to the house, so she could kind of get the weight off of her and wouldn't feel like she was being taken care of.
Larlene works as a teacher's assistant with special needs children.
My mom liked kids and everything, and she liked drawing and everything.
I'm going out with friends. Don't wait up, I'll probably be late.
You do what you gotta do.
The marriage is hanging together by a thread. Then, at 72 years old, Cecil is laid off.
Bailey, come on. We're gonna get through this.
We gave her money at church. She was borrowing money from neighbors, people at school.
Look, I'm trying, but this is hard for me, The city's run by a bunch of...
Don't be passing it off, Cecil. This is your fault. You need to find something quick. Because at this rate, this will be one of the last breakfasts I cook for you.
She's like, he's not worried about money. I'm pawning my jewelry and he's sitting back watching TV. He has $20,000 in the safe.
With their security now at stake, it seems their marriage may be too.
When Larlene goes out and gets herself a job, it's going to begin to throw off the pattern that they've already developed. And in all likelihood, it's going to make Cecil feel inadequate, not cared for, possibly resentful. And so the one thing that he was bringing to the relationship is now gone. What is left for him?
It's emasculating to realize that your wife, who you always have felt needed you and that you have met those needs, now either doesn't need you or needs you and you're not able to meet the needs.
And it now is looking like she is slipping away from him. And so he's going to begin to feel possibly desperate, anxious, worried about where this relationship is going.
In an attempt to keep her spirits high, Larlene finds a way to distract herself.
There you are. Ali, this is my daughter-in-law, Tahira. Tahira, this is Ali, a good friend of mine.
Good to meet you, Tahira. See you soon.
I saw the little twinkle in his eye and the little twinkle in her eye, and I was like, okay, there's something more there.
A few weeks later, Tahira's suspicions are confirmed.
He is real good with his hands. It's okay to have a little secret on the side. They'll tell you all the sweet nothings that your husband's not telling you.
I knew that it was the guy from the rental car place. It made me so uncomfortable that my husband came home and found me crying in the living room, and he asked me what was wrong, and I proceeded to tell him that his mother was having an affair on his dad.
News Tahira's husband, Cecil Jr., doesn't take kindly to.
Don't you dare. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because I was like, at this point, why don't you just go your own way and just leave him where he's at?
Ali is a friend. I'm just helping his family come over from Jamaica's all. That's what a God-fearing Christian woman does.
Do married Christian women have sex with their friends in need?
But Cecil Jr. decides if Larlene won't do anything, he'll take matters into his own hands.
I went up to his job and I confronted him.
I think she was in lust with him.
After 72-year-old Cecil Brown loses his job, his marriage to Larlene begins to fall apart. And when their son, Cecil Jr., realizes his mother is keeping secrets, he can't contain his rage.
Yo. You Allie?
Yeah, man.
I'm Larlane's son. Who? Larlane. Married woman. Married to my dad.
So?
Don't with me, man. Don't you ever forget my face. Because you don't want to be seeing it again. Do we understand each other? Yeah. That's what I thought. Hey, Dad. What's going on? I can't help you with that.
I got it. You want something?
Wanted to talk to you about Mom. You know where she's at?
She's probably out with her boyfriend.
Dad, you knew about it?
This is a man that pays attention to everything. I mean, absolutely everything. So, and to me, there was no way that he did not know or could not have known.
I just talked.
My father's business was my father's business, and I stayed out of my father's business. I was taught that as a kid. He's a big boy, he can take care of himself. He's a proud man.
She always comes back.
Looking at Larlane at this point in her life, I would say she is a target for an affair. She is in a married relationship that has been long-term, and the man that she fell in love with isn't the man that she fell in love with. He is now not working. He is not interested in going out. He's not very attentive or fun anymore. And she is longing for something.
I think Cecil at least must have inklings that Larlane is cheating on him, and yet he stays. And I think there are a couple of different reasons that may be. One may be he knows that he cheated on his previous wife for many years, and he may feel in some ways that this is sort of karma, and it's sort of his turn. It may also be that he's in his 70s, and if he thinks, you know, where am I going to go from here?
Luckily, Cecil finds a new job, easing their money worries. And with his implicit blessing, Larlane and Ali continue their affair.
I think she was in lust with him because he was younger than her. He could satisfy her sexually. Larlane was like a kid in a candy store. She was in bliss. It's the happiest I've ever seen her.
Despite Cecil's new job, it seems the household finances are on life support, and no one knows why.
This ain't been paid. Why?
You checking up on me?
I thought we were catching up.
I'm trying my best.
Larlane! Look, I don't understand. What's going on?
Learn to read, Cecil.
Look, talk to me! Where's my money?
I was totally, stunned. Because my whole life, my father's never had money problems. Never.
2 units to clear for a 911 in progress. TAC 2, I copy that you're en route.
K9 has been called out. K9-1 is responding.
I was upstairs in my house. My daughter came running into my room and said, "There's someone outside screaming for help." So I, ran outside and I found Larlene. And Larlene was wailing and she gestured to me to come. And there was Cecil lying in the dust. I knew immediately that he was dead.
He had been struck numerous times in the head with a hard object, more than once, and each injury or impact would have been incapacitating from the beginning.
This is not a drug deal gone by. This is not a gang member. There's no logical reason that you could attach as to why this man would be the victim of such a violent death.
Our initial immediate reaction would be, was this a robbery gone bad?
And then as people on the block started talking, there was some theory that there had been an intruder who had maybe been stealing his tools from his tool shed.
But on closer inspection, the crime scene suggests something different.
With each card spread out around the feet, it appeared to be staged a little bit. If someone were going for a credit card in a wallet, they would take the credit card and drop the wallet. They wouldn't typically pull every card out.
Maybe the assault was committed by someone who had a grudge.
Police hope Larlene can shed some light on Cecil's last morning.
I was at home cleaning, I think.
Cecil Brown went to work like he often did at 5 a.m. And when he arrived, they realized they weren't going to be able to do much that day because it had rained the night before.
Hi, it's Larlene. Could I speak with my husband, please?
He spoke with Larlene on the telephone and let her know that he would be coming home. She told him to pick up his check from work.
Is that you, Mr. B? You got something for me? Thank you.
My baby. Marlene told detectives that her husband had come home and that when she went to the bank to deposit his paycheck, he was out in the yard getting ready to repair the car.
Cecil? Cecil, baby, you home? Cecil?
It's a tragic story, but police need more details.
I asked her if he had a cell phone. She indicated that he did, but that the service had been disconnected.
I called my husband on his best friend Freddie's phone.
I asked if I could have Freddie's telephone number.
If you give me your phone, I can check your phone log.
Damn smartphones. Smarter than me. I never could quite figure them out.
I didn't find a call to Freddie, but I did find a call to someone named Ali in her cell phone at 6:40 in the morning.
Who's this Ali?
A friend. He works at the car rental. I called him this morning because he's detailing my car. It slipped my mind.
I did ask her if they had any type of relationship because I felt that it was important to just ask the question.
I'm a married woman. Ali is young enough to be my son. What exactly are you trying to insinuate?
It seems the more police continue to question, the more heated the interviews become.
You seem very agitated.
This woman, my mother, has been screwing around my father for almost a year now.
My reaction as soon as he said that was, well, now that phone call at 6:40 in the morning makes sense. It was a red flag, but just because someone is not faithful in the relationship doesn't mean that they commit a murder.
Or does it? Will this family's secrets and lies finally be exposed?
Why would you want to lie about that unless you have something serious to hide?
I was begging him not to let my dad be an unsolved murder.
73-year-old Cecil Brown has been found bludgeoned to death in his backyard in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Police have a couple of leads, but no suspects. Then Cecil Jr. reveals his parents' deepest secret.
He immediately told me that he knew that his mother was having an affair with a subject named Ali.
Homicide Detective Richard Poole questions Ali.
I asked him to describe to me what he did that day, starting from the morning when he woke up until the time he spoke with me.
So you must have driven your green station wagon to work.
I don't know no green wagon.
I asked him if there was a sexual relationship with Larlene.
Larlene, she's just a friend. She just helped me with my immigration issues.
Poole checks Ali's whereabouts the day of the murder.
We have proof that he clocked in at 12:54 that afternoon.
Ali was not at work until after the murder had been committed. Ali did not have an alibi in this case.
My interview with Ali, I asked him if he drove a car, and when he said that he didn't, it was a little suspicious. Why would you want to lie about that unless you have something serious to hide? So I had investigators look in the parking lots all throughout the area. About a quarter mile away in an apartment complex, they found the station wagon. And in running the license plate, it showed that it belonged to Larlene Brown.
Finding out that Larlene bought this car for Ali was a big shock to the police, and it was a key turning point in the case.
But Cecil was the person really paying for it.
Larlene, how much did you say those bills was?
It's $2,500.
These bills and bank account notices were coming to the Colby Avenue address, but unfortunately Cecil Brown couldn't read what they said. She really took advantage of Cecil Brown's inability to read and write. That was evidence that reinforced the belief that they were having an affair that they were trying to keep secret from Cecil Brown.
It wasn't proof that she committed the murder.
What the police need is hard evidence. So they turn their attention to the station wagon.
The car was spotless. It was obviously recently completely washed and detailed, which isn't unusual for the type of work that Ali did.
But a meticulous search does come up with a possible lead. A small stain that looks like it could be blood.
It was on the floorboard where the foot would be. So if you had stepped in blood and then you got into the car, it would, you would transfer it. We thought that was a great lead.
The sample is sent to the lab for analysis.
Larlene showed up late at the funeral home, dressed like she was ready for a picnic. I never saw tears. I heard this made-up sound.
She didn't grieve. She was a terrible actress. Like, take her Oscar. It was a fake cry.
I'm like, you ain't kiss him that much in life. But now you just keep kissing him. Like, is that a guilt thing? Like, is that a I'm sorry thing?
Even though Larlene has not been a loyal wife and she's been cheating on Cecil, it is possible that in his death, she is sad about it. He's like a family member to her. She's known him for years, and so her effusive attentiveness, the kissing, might be genuine grief.
Having said that, here's somebody who has not behaved very lovingly to Cecil in the recent past and seems to be making a big show of behaving lovingly towards him at the funeral. That could be covering up involvement in his passing. That could be feelings of guilt over having not been very loving to him, and then now he's gone and there's no way to make amends for that, and so there's a combination of grief and guilt.
Then detectives received the lab results of the bloodstain in Ali's station wagon.
The results from the DNA analysis indicated that it was not blood that was located in the vehicle. It was very disappointing to find out that what we thought was possibly DNA located in the vehicle turned out to be a false positive.
Larlane's alibi, a visit to the bank, is also confirmed.
Investigators were able to pull video footage of Larlane at her local bank. She was at the bank cashing the paycheck at approximately 11:21, which is right when she claimed the murder occurred,
leaving police without a viable suspect or tangible evidence. Weeks go by, and Cecil's son and daughter worry the investigation has stalled.
I was begging him not to let my dad be an unsolved murder.
And when the cops take a closer look, the case takes a shocking turn.
They had a history of fighting that led to violence on the day of the murder.
What do you need? Because what do I have to hide? I'm not hiding anything.
Without any physical evidence connecting Larlane Brown and her lover Aliza Day to her husband Cecil's murder, the investigation is at a standstill. But this all changes when Larlane points the finger at someone else, her own son.
I said, well, who do you think did it? And she's like, well, I don't know. Cecil and his dad didn't get along very well.
Get off me! Not in my house, boy!
Cecil Pinnell and his dad had a terrible relationship, and that they had a history of fighting that led to violence on the day of the murder.
Because me and my father argued a lot sometimes, and it got really loud. Because at 16, we had our first physical fight. He smacked me 3 times. I hit my head on the closet, and that was it. So we fought.
Police follow up on Larlane's theory.
That's true, but that was a long time ago. She's leading you down the wrong path, man.
I still need to see your phone.
They get my cell phone records and verify where I was. What do you need? Because what do I have to hide? I'm not hiding anything. So whatever you need is fine by me.
Police quickly learn that Larlane is lying.
Their relationship was flourishing. You could see the proudness on my father-in-law's face when he looked at my husband.
If you spent 5 minutes with Cecil Pinnell, you would know that he loved his father and that he never would have committed this murder.
Larlane's finger-pointing only serves to implicate her. But Cecil Jr.'s love for his father threatens to sabotage the entire investigation. He's determined to see where all of his father's money went.
I went home and I loaded up my shotgun. And I was gonna go back and kill Mr. Ali.
Hello.
The chief of police for Tacoma Park, I served with him at Fort Meade, so he knows me outside of his police duties. He asked me gentlemen, just let me handle this one. I know that's your dad, but I'm gonna put my best people on it. Let me handle it.
Since police have no physical evidence, they ask the FBI to analyze Larlane and Ali's cell phones. The police have a compelling circumstantial case. But with no DNA and no murder weapon, the state's attorney is unwilling to take the case to trial.
The failure to find DNA or have DNA, it's always a concern. We live in a CSI world.
We still needed some sort of hard evidence.
Finally, the FBI comes back with their cell phone analysis.
The cell phones that Ali and Larlane had were connecting with a tower in the area of the residence. The FBI could estimate how far away from the tower Larlane and Ali were at the time of the crime, and the distance that they were able to calculate placed them right in the area of Colby Avenue.
Ali?
Larlene. Could I speak with Cecil, please? Thanks.
Larlene calls her husband to make sure that he's on his way home.
Hey, baby. What time are you coming home for dinner tonight?
He tells her that he's getting his paycheck and that he is coming home at that time. He gets home close to 10 o'clock. Larlene tells us during a police interview that she cooks breakfast for her husband. We believe that's true.
We ain't done this in a long time.
Maybe I should do it more.
Hey.
There were text messages between Larlene and Ali in the moments leading up to the murder. Ali was in the residence, hiding in the basement. Our cell phone information places Ali at the residence beginning at around 8:21 that morning.
Apologize to you for this morning. It was uncalled for. It's just been a very difficult time.
Ali went to work to start establishing a potential alibi, and Larlene went to the bank to then establish her alibi. It's when Larlene comes back from the bank that she sort of begins this charade of finding the body for the first time and the charade of being a grieving spouse.
Larlene's motive is simple.
Part of the motivation for this murder was Larlene's fear that she was in too deep, that she had spent too much of the family money, that she had created a hole that she could no longer dig herself out of.
I believe she spent up all my father-in-law's money. And she knew that if he found out, my father-in-law was going to kill her. So it was either him or her. So she had to get rid of him.
One might ask themselves, Larlene and Cecil have been together for so many years. Why would she kill him now? And you might speculate, well, it's because she's in love with Ali and she wants to be with him. But we already know that she doesn't truly make connections with people. She isn't connected to her own son. And so the answer that I can say is that she reached a point where it was going to better serve her to have him dead than alive. Because that's what sociopaths do. They look for what serves them best. And this was the turning point, her fear that he would be so angry about the money, maybe he would have killed her, that she decided it was better to take the risk to have him killed than it was to take the risk of what was going to happen to her if he found out what she's been doing.
Larlene could have gotten divorced and had half of whatever their home was worth, whatever assets were there in the marriage, but she didn't want to settle for that. She wanted all of it. She thought she's going to get away with it, and it seems to me she probably envisioned in her mind, I'm going to get out of this with him gone. Everybody's going to think I'm the victim because my husband was murdered, and they're going to feel sorry for me, and nobody's going to blame me. They're going to be glad I'm moving on, to see me moving on and carrying on with my life. I'm going to have all the money, and he's going to be gone, but he didn't have much of a life anyway. He was miserable. He didn't want to do anything. He was having some health problems. He was having a hard time staying employed. I've put him out of his misery.
On April 7th, 2017, Larlene Pennell Brown and Ali Zadeh are each found guilty of second-degree murder. They are given the maximum sentence of 30 years in jail.
I think Larlene has two parts to herself. I think she has a good and she has an evil. And I think evil started to win.
My father always loved my mom. There was nothing he wouldn't do for her, nothing. I miss my dad like every day. He was the best friend I ever had. Just unfortunate that it ended up the way it did.
When we look at the garments hanging in our closets, the shirts we wear to work, or the jackets that keep us warm, we rarely consider the journey those pieces of fabric have taken before resting against our skin. We look at the labels, perhaps checking the washing instructions or the size, and our eyes might briefly brush past the words that indicate where the item was made. For decades, a specific label has carried a profound weight in the global market, symbolizing quality, fair labor, and the realization of a universal aspiration. That label is made in the United States of America. It is a phrase that conjures images of regulated industries, protected workers, and the enduring promise of the American dream. A dream built on the foundational belief that hard work guarantees freedom and prosperity. Major brands, household names trusted by millions of consumers such as JCPenney and Target, relied on this implicit promise when stocking their shelves. Customers purchasing these items trusted that the clothing was produced under the strict, humane standards mandated by United States labor laws. However, history often harbors dark, unseen corners where this promise is not merely broken, but violently shattered. This is the story of one such corner, a place where the American dream was weaponized, twisted into an instrument of unimaginable exploitation, and where those familiar labels were sewn by hands trembling from exhaustion, bleeding from abuse, and driven by the hollow ache of starvation. It is a narrative of profound betrayal, revealing how a modern-day slave camp operated in plain sight on American soil, masked by the sheer geographical isolation of a remote island and the chilling indifference of those in power. To understand how such an atrocity could unfold, we must first look at the setting, a location that feels worlds away from the bustling mainland of the United States, yet falls entirely under its jurisdiction. Far out in the vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean lies American Samoa, an unincorporated territory of the United States. It is a place characterized by lush, volcanic landscapes, deep blue waters, and a small, tightly knit community. Specifically, our focus turns to the village of Tafuna, a settlement on the main island. In the late 1990s, Tafuna was relatively quiet, a stark contrast to the massive industrial hubs found in Asia or the American mainland. It was here, in this isolated tropical setting, that the foundation for a sprawling, horrific enterprise was laid. The geographical reality of American Samoa is crucial to understanding the mechanics of the crime that would soon consume hundreds of lives. Being an island, it inherently possesses natural boundaries. There are no borders to walk across, no neighboring states to flee to in the dead of night. For anyone brought to this territory, the ocean itself acts as a formidable wall, a vast, inescapable moat that severely limits any chance of independent escape. It is a beautiful location, but for those trapped within its confines, that beauty quickly morphs into a claustrophobic, inescapable prison. It was the perfect environment for someone looking to operate outside the scrutiny of mainland regulators while still reaping the benefits of operating under the banner of a United States territory. In the year 1999, the architect of this nightmare arrived in Tafuna to establish his dominion. His name was Kil Lee, a Korean-American businessman who recognized the unique legal and geographical loopholes that American Samoa offered. Lee established a garment manufacturing facility named the Dewusa Factory. On paper, and to the outside world, the Dewusa Factory appeared to be a standard, legitimate business venture. It was an enterprise designed to fulfill the massive production demands of prominent American retail chains, processing massive orders for brands like JCPenney and Target. The business model relied on the cachet of the Made in USA label, which the factory could legally attach to its garments due to its location in an American territory. By doing so, Lee positioned his factory to avoid the stigma and tariffs often associated with foreign sweatshops, presenting his operation as a compliant, domestic producer. However, the true nature of the Dewusa factory was far from compliant, and the business model Lee envisioned relied entirely on the systemic, ruthless subjugation of foreign laborers. To run his factory, Lee needed a workforce that was not only cheap but entirely controllable. A workforce desperate enough to endure severe hardships and isolated enough to have no voice. He found his targets thousands of miles away, focusing his recruitment efforts heavily on vulnerable populations in Vietnam and China. The recruitment process was built on an elaborate, carefully constructed deception, preying on the deepest hopes and vulnerabilities of the working class individuals in these countries. Agents representing Kill Sully approached potential workers with a proposition that seemed nothing short of miraculous. They offered a chance to leave behind a life of limited opportunities and travel to what they described as American soil. The core of this deception was the promise of a highly lucrative salary, specifically guaranteeing an income of $400 per month. In 1999, for workers in rural or economically depressed areas of Vietnam and China, $400 a month was an astronomical sum. A staggering amount of money that represented not just a living wage, but a pathway to entirely alter the trajectory of their families' lives. It was an opportunity to send children to school, to build secure homes, to care for aging parents, and to permanently escape the cycle of poverty. The recruiters painted a vivid picture of the American dream, a future filled with prosperity and security, waiting for them just across the ocean at the Dewusa factory. Over 200 individuals, driven by this desperate hope and an overwhelming desire to provide for their loved ones, accepted the offer. They believed they were embarking on a challenging but rewarding journey to a land of opportunity. However, the devastating reality of Kill Sully's operation began long before these workers ever set foot on the island of American Samoa. The trap was meticulously designed to strip them of their autonomy before the journey even commenced. To secure one of these highly coveted positions at the factory, each worker, particularly those from Vietnam, was required to pay an exorbitant brokerage fee. This fee ranged anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 United States dollars. For the impoverished workers targeted by the recruiters, this was an impossible sum to produce out of pocket. To pay this mandatory fee, the workers were forced into catastrophic financial decisions. Families mortgaged their small homes, handing over the deeds to their only properties. They took out massive loans from local lenders, often at predatory interest rates. They borrowed from every relative and friend they could find, accumulating a crippling mountain of debt. This was the true, insidious brilliance of Lee's scheme. By forcing the workers to assume this massive financial burden, he ensured they were effectively bound to him before they even began working. This was not merely an employment contract. It was the initiation of profound debt bondage. The workers were no longer free agents. They were individuals chained by severe financial obligations. They had to work. They had to earn that promised $400 a month, because failing to do so meant the total financial ruin of their entire families back home. They would lose their homes, face their creditors, and plunge their loved ones into deeper destitution. The debt created an invisible, unbreakable tether, transforming them into modern-day indentured servants before they even boarded their flights. Upon arriving in American Samoa, after a long and exhausting journey across the Pacific, the workers finally reached the Dewusa factory in Tafuna. Any lingering hope that the exorbitant fees and the grueling journey were justified was violently extinguished within moments of their arrival. The transition from hopeful employee to captive victim was instantaneous and brutal. As soon as the workers stepped onto the factory grounds, Kill Sully and his management team demanded their passports and all identifying travel documents. These vital documents, their only legal proof of identity and their only means of returning home, were systematically confiscated and locked away. Without their passports, the workers were instantly stripped of their legal standing, their mobility, and their basic human rights. They were rendered entirely stateless and undocumented in an unfamiliar territory. The profound psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. It was the moment the trap definitively snapped shut. The workers, burdened by overwhelming debt and now stripped of their identification, realized with terrifying clarity that they were entirely at the mercy of Kil Lee. They were stranded on a remote island in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from their homes, unable to speak the local language, unable to communicate with the outside world, and utterly trapped. The physical environment of the Dewusa factory immediately reflected their newly realized captive status. They were not led to the clean, regulated dormitories one might expect of an American manufacturing facility. Instead, they were herded into a heavily fortified compound that functioned entirely as a prison camp. The workers were confined to a series of rudimentary, suffocatingly hot tin houses. In the sweltering, humid tropical climate of American Samoa, these metal structures acted like ovens, trapping the intense heat and making the living conditions nearly unbearable. The compound itself was completely enclosed by high fences topped with sharp barbed wire, an unmistakable visual declaration of their imprisonment. Furthermore, the perimeter was actively patrolled around the clock by a team of local guards hired by Lee. These guards maintained a 24-hour watch, ensuring that no one could leave the compound without explicit permission. The workers were effectively locked away from the outside world, hidden behind the corrugated tin and the razor wire. They had traveled across the globe chasing the promise of the American dream, investing everything they owned and everything they could borrow into a vision of a better future. But as the heavy gates of the Dewusa compound closed behind them, they found themselves descending rapidly into an unimaginable nightmare. A brutal reality of forced labor and profound suffering that would unfold in the shadow of the very nation they had hoped would be their salvation. The stage was now completely set for one of the most horrific abuses of human life in modern industrial history, a systemic program of exploitation that would strip them of their dignity, their health, and for some, their bodies. The moment the heavy gates of the compound closed, the brutal reality of the Dewusa factory set in, instantly stripping away any lingering illusions of a prosperous American working environment. The workers, deeply exhausted from their transatlantic journeys from the rural provinces of Vietnam and China, were not ushered into comfortable dormitories or standard employee housing that one might expect from a facility manufacturing goods for major retail chains. Instead, they were immediately confronted with the stark, unforgiving architecture of their new, terrifying existence. They were housed in hastily constructed, severely poorly ventilated tin structures that offered no respite from the elements. In the unrelenting, suffocating tropical climate of American Samoa, where humidity constantly clings to the skin and the equatorial sun beats down with fierce intensity, these corrugated metal buildings functioned as literal ovens. The intense heat trapped within the uninsulated metal walls was oppressive, making it profoundly difficult to breathe, let alone rest or recover after grueling, endlessly long hours of forced labor. Surrounding these suffocating living quarters was a fortified perimeter that left absolutely no ambiguity about their newly acquired captive status. Imposing high fences, heavily fortified with menacing, coiled barbed wire, entirely encircled the manufacturing compound. This imposing barrier was clearly not a standard security measure designed to keep unauthorized intruders out. It was a carefully constructed cage designed specifically to keep the desperate workers locked in. To ruthlessly enforce this physical confinement, Kil Lee employed a dedicated detail of local guards who continuously patrolled the factory grounds 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The constant, looming, and intimidating presence of these guards ensured that absolutely every movement was strictly monitored, establishing a pervasive, inescapable atmosphere of intense surveillance and absolute authoritarian control. The individuals inside were no longer recognized as human employees. They had been aggressively transformed into inmates within a privately run, corporate prison camp operating in the shadows of an American territory. This severe physical confinement was immediately compounded by a profound psychological imprisonment initiated the very moment they had arrived on the island. The immediate, Systematic confiscation of their passports and all identifying travel documents by Kilsuli and his management apparatus was a calculated, devastating blow to their personal autonomy. Without their passports, they were effectively and entirely erased from the legal landscape. They instantly became invisible ghosts within the territory, utterly unable to prove their identities, unable to seek legitimate employment or assistance elsewhere, and most crucially, entirely incapable of boarding a flight to return to the safety of their home countries. They were completely stranded in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, physically trapped behind razor wire, and completely isolated from the outside world. The juxtaposition of their environment was incredibly cruel and agonizing. Just beyond the rusted metal fences and the constantly watchful eyes of the hostile guards lay the breathtaking natural beauty of a tropical island, a paradise characterized by lush greenery, vibrant landscapes, and expansive, liberating ocean views. Yet, for the 200 workers trapped inside the claustrophobic De Wusa compound, that beauty was entirely inaccessible, serving only as a bitter, mocking reminder of their complete and utter loss of freedom. They were completely severed from their families, entirely unable to communicate their desperate plight and bound tightly by the crushing, suffocating weight of the massive debts they had incurred just to secure their own heartbreaking captivity. The psychological toll of this extreme isolation began to rapidly erode their spirits as the brutal, unrelenting reality of their daily lives took hold. Within the desolate confines of this newly established hell, the cruelty extended far beyond mere physical captivity and psychological isolation. Kilsuli ruthlessly implemented a chilling, systematic regimen of starvation driven by an insatiable, sociopathic desire to maximize his profit margins at the absolute expense of basic human survival. Food, a fundamental human right and a critical basic necessity for individuals forced into performing strenuous, continuous manual labor, was maliciously weaponized. To cut factory operational costs to the absolute minimum, management drastically and intentionally slashed the workers' daily food rations. The meals provided in the compound were not only nutritionally void but painfully, dangerously scarce. Workers were frequently given absolutely nothing more than a meager, inadequate portion of plain white rice, completely devoid of any vital protein, necessary vegetables, or basic sustenance required to fuel their rapidly deteriorating bodies. To make the dry, tasteless rice even slightly palatable, or perhaps simply to add any kind of recognizable flavor to their desolate, inadequate diets, they were often forced to consume it with nothing but plain, harsh salt water. Day after agonizing day, week after torturous week, this catastrophic lack of nutrition became their standard, mandated diet. The human body, when continuously subjected to intense physical labor in a sweltering, hostile environment without proper caloric intake, inevitably begins to consume itself to survive. The workers began to visibly waste away, their physical energy levels plummeting drastically as severe malnutrition took hold. The vibrant, hopeful individuals who had boarded airplanes in Vietnam and China with dreams of prosperity were rapidly reduced to emaciated, deeply exhausted shadows of their former selves, ruthlessly forced to operate heavy, dangerous sewing machinery while their fragile bodies silently screamed for basic nourishment. The profound desperation bred by this calculated, systemic starvation forced the captive workers to resort to extreme, heartbreaking measures simply to endure another day. Driven by the gnawing, constant, and agonizing ache in their empty stomachs, they began to desperately scavenge the dirt areas immediately surrounding their sweltering tin dormitories and the inner perimeter of the barbed wire fences. They frantically searched the barren ground for absolutely anything edible, scouring the dirt for wild vegetables, bitter edible weeds, and even tough, fibrous tree roots that happened to grow within their enclosure. Boiling these scavenged, often highly unpalatable plants became a necessary, pathetic daily ritual to slightly supplement the meager, insufficient rations of rice and salt water provided by their captors. They were tragically reduced to foraging like desperate animals within the confines of their own cage. Yet, even this verily miserable existence was never guaranteed. The provision of even the most inadequate, minimal food was strictly, mercilessly tied to unyielding, incredibly demanding production quotas. Kilsuli actively utilized starvation not just as a cold, cost-cutting business measure, but as a direct, terrifying tool for punishment and workplace coercion. If a worker, weakened by hunger, failed to meet the impossibly high manufacturing targets set by the factory management, or if an entire production line inevitably fell behind an unreasonable schedule, the punishment was swift, collective, and devastating. Management would simply withhold all food entirely. There were documented, prolonged periods where groups of workers were intentionally starved for several consecutive days as a draconian penalty for their perceived inefficiency on the factory floor. They were violently forced to continue working the sewing machines, handling the crisp garments destined for pristine American retail stores, while completely deprived of any sustenance whatsoever. Their vision blurring dangerously and their frail hands shaking uncontrollably from profound physical weakness. One systematic starvation alone proved insufficient to extract the absolute maximum possible labor from the deeply exhausted, traumatized workforce. Kilsuli and his enforcers readily escalated their tactics to horrific, unrestrained physical violence. The Dewusa factory operated strictly under a brutal regime of absolute terror, where any minor sign of resistance, any perceived slowness on the machines, or even a simple, unavoidable mistake on the production line was met with immediate, brutal retaliation. The local guards, acting on the direct, explicit orders from factory management, were the blunt instruments of this profound cruelty. Workers who inevitably fell behind on their impossible quotas or dared to verbally express their extreme exhaustion were routinely subjected to severe, traumatic beatings. The violence deployed was never random. It was a highly systemic, calculated method of control specifically designed to permanently break the workers' spirits and instill a deep, paralyzing fear that would ensure total compliance. A particularly common and utterly terrifying form of punishment involved violently dragging a targeted worker away from the busy factory floor and physically locking them inside a completely dark, heavily isolated room within the compound. Within these pitch-black, terrifying confines, the helpless victims were subjected to horrifying psychological and severe physical abuse away from the eyes of their peers. The guards frequently utilized heavy iron pipes and solid metal bars as brutal instruments of torture, viciously striking the defenseless workers in the darkness. The sickening sound of heavy metal connecting with fragile human bone and the muffled, desperate cries of the isolated victims served as a chilling, effective warning to the rest of the terrified workforce listening on the other side of the thin walls. It was a clear, unmistakable message that any form of disobedience or failure would result in severe physical agony. The workers existed in a perpetual, exhausting state of profound anxiety, knowing intimately that a single misstep or a momentary lapse in manufacturing speed could easily result in a brutal, life-altering physical beating. This continuously escalating atmosphere of weaponized starvation, relentless forced labor, and extreme physical violence inevitably pushed the desperate, trapped workforce toward an explosive breaking point. The devastating climax of this localized brutality occurred in November of the year 2000, a dark month that would forever stain the hidden history of the Dewusa factory with indelible, unforgettable horror. By this critical juncture, the captive workers had not only been subjected to unimaginable, daily physical and mental abuse, but they had also been entirely, systematically denied the financial wages they were originally promised. For several long, agonizing, and desperate months, Kilsuli had flatly refused to pay them anything at all for their grueling labor. The promise of $400 a month that had successfully lured them across the vast ocean proved to be a complete, malicious phantom promise. Faced with the immediate threat of starvation, the reality of constant beatings, and the blatant, complete theft of their daily labor, a group of incredibly brave, profoundly pushed to the brink workers collectively decided they could simply no longer endure the relentless abuse in silence. They bravely organized a labor strike, completely halting their work on the busy factory floor to explicitly demand the financial wages they were rightfully owed and to openly protest the abhorrent, inhumane living conditions they were forced to endure. It was a desperate, incredibly risky plea for basic human dignity and survival. However, Kilsili did not respond to their pleas with peaceful negotiations, dialogue, or basic concessions. Instead, he coldly chose to crush the desperate uprising with overwhelming, terrifying physical violence. He explicitly ordered his large detail of local guards to directly attack the group of striking workers, instantly initiating a highly chaotic, wildly disproportionate, and violently bloody confrontation within the confines of the enclosed compound. The ensuing chaotic melee was a scene of absolute, unrestrained terror and brutality. Unarmed, severely malnourished, and physically weak workers were suddenly besieged by aggressive guards wielding heavy, blunt instruments with malicious intent. The peaceful confrontation rapidly and violently devolved into a brutal massacre of human spirit and physical bodies. Amidst the intense chaos of the suppression, the violence reached a truly horrifying, unforgettable apex, zeroing in specifically on a female worker who had traveled from Vietnam, a woman named Quyen. As she stood bravely among her fellow captive workers, rightfully demanding the basic financial compensation she had bled and starved for, she was directly targeted by one of the deeply enraged factory guards. In a sudden moment of shocking, unspeakable, and life-altering savagery, the guard aggressively raised a heavy, solid iron pipe and violently thrust it directly into Quyen's face with maximum force. The heavy metal pipe struck her with devastating, crushing impact, violently piercing entirely through her fragile eye. The unimaginable, immediate agony of that horrific moment, the sudden terrifying darkness that enveloped her vision, and the sheer, unadulterated brutality of the physical act perfectly encapsulated the absolute, unchecked evil actively operating within the Dewusa walls. The desperate labor strike was subsequently violently and ruthlessly suppressed, leaving severely broken bodies, heavily bleeding wounds, and deeply shattered spirits in its devastating wake. Quyen miraculously survived the horrific, targeted physical attack, but the profound physical damage was tragically irreversible. She was left permanently and irreversibly blind in that eye. Her permanent, painful physical disfigurement stood as a gruesome, lasting, and undeniable testament to the true, horrifying human cost of the pristine garments being manufactured in that isolated facility. She, like so many countless others trapped alongside her, had bravely come seeking a vastly better life to support her impoverished family, only to have her literal vision violently and permanently stolen from her by an iron pipe in a makeshift corporate prison camp situated quietly on American soil. The desperate strike of November 2000 did not result in long-awaited freedom or the payment of unpaid wages. It instead resulted in a horrifying, permanent escalation of systemic violence, conclusively proving to the entire captive workforce that their captors possessed absolutely no boundaries, zero basic empathy, and maintained an absolute, terrifying willingness to permanently physically maim anyone who dared to demand their fundamental human rights. The immediate aftermath of the horrific violence inflicted upon Quyen did not bring the intervention of emergency medical services or the swift arrival of law enforcement that one would inherently expect on American soil. Instead, the bloody conclusion of the November strike ushered in a new, profoundly darker chapter of psychological torment for the captive workforce at the Dewusa factory. The sight of their fellow worker permanently maimed, her vision stolen by a brutal strike from an iron pipe, served as a paralyzing demonstration of absolute power. It was a visceral, undeniable proof that the management possessed an unchecked willingness to destroy them physically. The factory floor, stained with the physical evidence of this atrocity, was swiftly forced back into operation. The workers, deeply traumatized and now carrying the heavy burden of knowing that peaceful demands for unpaid wages would be met with life-altering mutilation, were driven back to their sewing machines. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the needle and thread resumed, but the atmosphere within the sweltering tin compound had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer just a place of extreme exploitation. It had completely solidified into a totalitarian nightmare where the value of a human life was demonstrably secondary to the relentless production of garments. The physical boundaries of their prison, the barbed wire and the patrolled fences, were now reinforced by an impenetrable psychological barrier constructed entirely of profound, paralyzing terror. They realized with absolute clarity that their captors operated completely without fear of consequence, unbound by any moral or legal restraint. To fully comprehend the absolute despair that settled over the Dewusa workers, one must examine the devastating paradox of their geographical reality. They were physically located within the jurisdiction of the United States of America, a nation globally recognized for its complex frameworks of labor laws, human rights protections, and institutionalized justice systems. The very garments they were forced to manufacture bore the labels that signified compliance with these supposedly rigorous mainland standards. Yet, the protection guaranteed by that national identity proved to be a catastrophic, fatal illusion for the hundreds of individuals trapped in Tafuna. The foundational concepts of emergency assistance, of a police force dedicated to serving and protecting the vulnerable, and of a legal system designed to intervene against corporate abuse were rendered completely non-existent within the borders of Kill Soli's operation. The workers, despite being geographically situated within an American territory, found themselves abandoned in a terrifying jurisdictional void. The invisible umbrella of American civil rights, which they might have desperately hoped would eventually shield them from such blatant atrocities, simply did not extend over the corrugated tin roofs of their sweltering dormitories. This stark realization that the location on the map offered absolutely no sanctuary was a psychological blow as devastating as the physical violence they endured. It meant that their suffering was not a temporary oversight waiting to be discovered by a vigilant authority, but rather a normalized, accepted reality within that specific localized environment. The terrifying silence surrounding the Dewusa factory was not an accident of geography. It was a carefully engineered mechanism of survival for the massive, illegal operation. Kill Suli had not simply built a manufacturing plant. He had strategically woven himself into the intricate social, political, and economic fabric of the local American Samoa community. Operating a business of that scale in a small island territory provided him with significant leverage and influence. He systematically cultivated highly beneficial, deeply entrenched relationships with key figures within the local government and the territorial law enforcement apparatus. These cultivated connections acted as a robust, impenetrable shield, effectively immunizing his brutal operation from any form of external scrutiny or legal consequence. He was not viewed by the local authorities as a ruthless human trafficker or a violent architect of modern slavery, but rather as a prominent businessman, an employer, and a powerful local entity whose operations were to be protected rather than investigated. This insidious network of corruption and willful blindness meant that the factory walls were fortified not just by physical guards, but by the very institutions that were supposed to dismantle them. The local police force, the primary mechanism of justice and the first line of defense against criminal activity, was entirely compromised by these relationships. The authorities were not ignorant of the massive compound in Tafuna, nor were they completely unaware of the massive workforce housed within its fenced perimeter, but they were deeply, systematically complicit in maintaining the terrifying status quo that allowed the abuse to flourish unchecked. The depth of this systemic betrayal became agonizingly clear whenever a desperate worker managed to momentarily pierce the veil of their isolation in a frantic attempt to seek outside help. Driven by the primal instinct for survival and the crushing weight of their daily torture, a few incredibly brave individuals managed to surreptitiously draft written complaints or desperately flag down passing local authorities near the factory perimeter. These acts required unimaginable courage, as the risk of discovery by the factory guards carried the explicit threat of severe physical retaliation. They meticulously documented the starvation, the rampant physical abuse, the total confiscation of their identifying passports, and the outright theft of their promised wages, hoping that placing this damning evidence into the hands of an official in an American uniform would trigger an immediate, massive rescue operation. However, the response they received was a betrayal of the highest, most devastating order. Instead of launching formal criminal investigations, conducting immediate welfare checks on the compound, or offering the desperate victims sanctuary, the local police systematically ignored the profound evidence of human trafficking and severe assault. Worse still, in a display of absolute, chilling complicity with the abuser, the authorities actively participated in the enforcement of the workers' captivity. Written complaints detailing the horrific conditions were routinely intercepted and handed directly back to Kill Suli. Desperate workers who had managed to momentarily escape the compound and reach a police station to report the severe beatings and starvation were not offered protection. They were physically detained by the officers and forcibly transported right back to the factory gates. Imagine the profound, universe-shattering horror of that specific experience. A worker, having risked everything, having navigated the terrifying, unfamiliar environment outside the barbed wire, finally reaches what they believe is the safety of law enforcement. They pour out their trauma, they point to their bruises, they beg for intervention, believing that the uniform represents salvation. And then, the very individual wearing that uniform places them in the back of a vehicle and drives them directly back to the architect of their nightmare. When the police car pulled up to the gates of the Dewusa factory and handed the escaping worker back over to the brutal local guards, the message delivered to the entire captive workforce was absolute, final, and thoroughly devastating. It vividly demonstrated that the local government was not merely turning a blind eye to their immense suffering. They were actively functioning as the outermost perimeter of Kill Suli's private prison system. The authorities were functioning as his personal retrieval service, guaranteeing that no matter how hard the workers fought, no matter how much evidence of violent felonies they managed to present, the system would always flawlessly protect the wealthy factory owner and completely abandon the destitute, foreign laborers. This profound corruption permanently extinguished any remaining flickers of hope that justice could be found locally. It cemented the terrifying reality that they were entirely on their own, completely invisible to the law, and violently trapped in a localized ecosystem where their abuser held absolute, undisputed authority over their lives, their bodies, and their freedom. The horrific isolation created by this systemic corruption was exponentially worsened by an insurmountable, deeply suffocating barrier of language. The workers who had been lured from the rural provinces of Vietnam and China arrived on the island of American Samoa without any functional knowledge of the English language, let alone the local Samoan dialect. They were violently thrust into a complex, terrifying environment where their inability to communicate effectively rendered them entirely mute and profoundly powerless. Even if they somehow managed to bypass the corrupt local authorities and reach someone willing to listen, they possessed absolutely no vocabulary to articulate the highly complex, systemic nature of their captivity. They could not properly explain the elaborate trap of the exorbitant brokerage fees that had resulted in their paralyzing debt bondage. They could not articulate the precise legal nightmare of having their passports confiscated, rendering them stateless and entirely undocumented. They could only show their visible, physical wounds, but without the crucial context of the systemic, corporate exploitation. Their profound suffering was easily dismissed or intentionally misunderstood by an indifferent outside world. The language barrier functioned as a thick, invisible, and completely soundproof wall that surrounded the Dewusa compound, trapping their desperate cries for help entirely within the confines of the corrugated tin structures. They were surrounded by a community situated within an inhabited territory, yet they were completely unable to bridge the linguistic divide to scream for salvation. This complete inability to communicate their truth to the outside world cultivated a unique, agonizing form of psychological torture. They were forced to endure severe physical trauma, continuous, gnawing starvation, and relentless, exhausting forced labor, all while being completely unable to tell their stories to anyone who could intervene. They were essentially buried alive, their immense suffering completely undocumented and unacknowledged by the world operating just beyond the razor wire fences. The deep, crushing despair that inevitably settled over the workforce was absolute and highly toxic. They were profoundly cut off from their families back in their home countries, entirely unable to send the desperately needed money they had promised. and completely incapable of warning their loved ones about the horrific trap they had fallen into. The crushing weight of the insurmountable financial debts they had incurred to secure these fatal jobs loomed constantly over them, a constant, nagging reminder that their families were likely facing severe financial ruin due to their disappearance into the silent void. The workers were reduced to existing in a perpetual, exhausting state of profound survival mode, completely stripped of their basic human dignity, their fundamental rights, and their highly valued voices. The terrifying silence that enveloped the Dewusa factory was not the absence of sound. It was the deliberate, systemic, and incredibly violent suppression of hundreds of human voices, a quiet, organized atrocity facilitated by overwhelming corruption, profound geographical isolation, and an insurmountable linguistic void that allowed a modern-day slave camp to thrive undetected under the protective shadow of the American flag. The situation had seemingly reached a state of permanent, irreversible darkness, a perfect, inescapable trap with absolutely no viable avenues for rescue or relief. The suffocating darkness that had enveloped the Dewusa factory, fortified by the complicity of local authorities and the brutal violence of the compound guards, seemed entirely impenetrable. Yet, within this absolute despair, a profound and desperate courage began to silently take root among a small group of captive workers. They had witnessed the horrific maiming of their peer. They had endured the excruciating ache of prolonged starvation. And they had felt the devastating betrayal of the local police, who had actively returned escapees to their tormentor. The realization that survival was impossible under the current regime forged a dangerous but necessary resolve. They understood with terrifying clarity that to remain within the corrugated tin walls meant a slow, agonizing demise, either through the systemic withholding of food or the sudden, lethal strike of an iron pipe. The decision to attempt another escape was not born of naive hope, but of a calculated, life or death absolute necessity. They knew the perimeter was constantly monitored by guards who operated with absolute impunity, and they knew the razor wire was designed to tear flesh. But the alternative of remaining captive was no longer survivable. This was to be a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous gamble, requiring them to risk their very lives one final time. They had to somehow bypass the constant surveillance, navigate a hostile and unfamiliar island environment, and find a way to communicate their immense suffering to entities far beyond the corrupted local jurisdiction. The psychological weight of this decision was monumental, as failure would undoubtedly result in brutal, potentially fatal retaliation from Kilsuli and his enforcers. They were preparing to challenge a deeply entrenched system of modern slavery armed with nothing but their fragile, emaciated bodies and a fierce, unbroken will to survive. The physical act of breaking out of the Dewusa compound required meticulous observation and agonizing patience. The desperate workers had to carefully study the patrol patterns of the local guards, identifying the brief, narrow windows of opportunity when the surveillance might momentarily lapse in the suffocating tropical heat. Every shadow, every blind spot along the fortified fence line became a critical focal point for their survival strategy. When the moment finally arrived, the escape was a terrifying, adrenaline-fueled surge into the unknown. They had to silently navigate past the corrugated tin dormitories, avoiding the sharp, coiled barbed wire that threatened to ensnare them, and alert the hostile patrols. Stepping beyond the perimeter meant entering an environment that, while geographically beautiful, was entirely alien and inherently dangerous for individuals who were severely malnourished, undocumented, and unable to speak the local language. They were fugitives on an island where the most powerful businessmen actively hunted them with the full cooperation of the local law enforcement. Every sound of a passing vehicle, every rustle in the dense tropical foliage amplified their profound terror. They could not seek refuge in the nearby villages, knowing that the corrupt local network would simply detain them and deliver them back to the factory gates. Their only viable path forward required them to completely bypass the established territorial structures and somehow project their desperate plea for help across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They were navigating a high-stakes labyrinth where a single misstep meant a return to the torture chambers they had just risked everything to flee. The true turning point in this harrowing narrative occurred when these brave escapees miraculously managed to establish contact with the outside world, effectively shattering the thick wall of silence that Kilsuli had so carefully constructed. Bypassing the local police force entirely, they sought out alternative channels, desperately looking for individuals or organizations that were not deeply entangled in the island's corrupt political and economic web. Through immense perseverance and sheer determination, they successfully reached out to international human rights organizations. This connection was the critical catalyst that finally ignited the machinery of justice. These organizations, operating on a global scale and dedicated to the eradication of forced labor, possess the necessary resources, linguistic capabilities, and institutional influence to comprehend the massive scale of the atrocity occurring in American Samoa. For the first time since their arrival, the workers were able to communicate the full, horrifying reality of their existence to entities willing to listen and capable of acting. The human rights advocates painstakingly documented the severe abuses, the systemic starvation, the confiscation of passports, and the horrific physical violence, translating the raw, desperate testimonies into comprehensive reports. Crucially, these organizations possess the authority and the direct channels to bypass the compromised territorial government and present this highly damning evidence directly to federal authorities. On the United States mainland, the narrative of the Dewusa factory was no longer confined to the corrupted whispers of Tafuna. It was now being violently thrust onto the desks of federal investigators in Washington. An undeniable dossier of human suffering demanding immediate, overwhelming intervention. The transmission of this overwhelming evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation marked a profound, seismic shift in the trajectory of the Dewusa case. The FBI, an agency equipped with vast jurisdictional authority and extensive resources, began to carefully analyze the harrowing reports emerging from the isolated Pacific territory. As federal agents reviewed the meticulous documentation provided by the human rights organizations and the desperate testimonies of the escaped workers, the staggering scope of Kilsuli's criminal enterprise became chillingly apparent. This was not a routine labor dispute or a minor regulatory violation. It was a massive, highly organized human trafficking network operating brazenly under the protective cover of the American flag. The federal authorities recognized that the local law enforcement apparatus was entirely compromised, necessitating a direct, uncompromising intervention from the mainland. The preparation for the raid was a highly classified, meticulously planned operation, designed to completely overwhelm the compound's defenses and secure the safety of the hundreds of captive individuals before Kilsuli could attempt to destroy evidence or further harm the vulnerable workforce. The agents had to navigate the complex logistics of launching a massive law enforcement action on a remote island, ensuring that their arrival would be swift, absolute, and entirely uncompromised by local interference. The operation was driven by a profound sense of urgency, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that every passing day within the corrugated tin walls meant further starvation, severe physical abuse, and the ongoing, systematic destruction of human lives. The federal machinery was finally in motion, bringing the full, undeniable weight of the United States justice system directly to the doorstep of the tropical prison camp. In the year 2001, the carefully planned federal operation culminated in a massive, decisive raid on the Dewusa factory. FBI agents, fully equipped and operating with absolute authority, descended upon the Tafuna compound, violently breaching the heavily fortified gates that had kept the workers trapped for so long. The sudden, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement instantly dismantled the terrifying regime of Kilsuli and his violent local guards. However, as the agents secured the perimeter and moved deep into the heart of the manufacturing facility, the profound, sickening reality of what they uncovered far exceeded even their most grim expectations. The federal investigators, seasoned professionals accustomed to confronting dark criminal realities, were entirely deeply shocked and visibly horrified by the devastating scenes that unfolded before them. They did not find a functioning corporate entity. They discovered a sprawling, catastrophic humanitarian disaster. The agents were immediately confronted by the sight of hundreds of severely emaciated human beings, their frail bodies bearing the undeniable visible scars of prolonged starvation and brutal physical trauma. The workers, deeply traumatized and clad in torn, filthy rags, stared back at their rescuers with hollow, exhausted eyes, entirely uncertain if this sudden intrusion represented genuine salvation or merely a new form of terror. The overwhelming sensory impact of the compound was deeply disturbing, a stark, irrefutable testament to the sheer scale of the systemic abuse. The physical environment within the compound provided a harrowing, silent testimony to the profound depths of Kil-Suli's cruelty. As the FBI agents painstakingly documented the crime scene, they were forced to navigate through incredibly terrible, life-threatening sanitary conditions. The living quarters, though sweltering, uninsulated corrugated tin structures, were severely overcrowded, filthy, and entirely devoid of basic human necessities. The air was thick, heavy with the oppressive heat and the undeniable stench of human suffering and profound neglect. The lack of proper plumbing, the complete absence of clean water, and the severe accumulation of waste created an environment that was not only degrading but highly conducive to the rapid spread of severe disease. The federal agents documented the rudimentary, pathetic attempts the desperate workers had made to survive, noting the areas where they had frantically scoured the dirt for edible roots and bitterweeds just to fill their aching stomachs. The sheer contrast between the pristine, highly valuable garments stacked neatly on the production floor and the broken, starving individuals forced to manufacture them was a deeply jarring, unforgettable visual representation of the ultimate betrayal of the American dream. The raid definitively shattered the long, terrifying silence that had blanketed the Dewusa factory, transforming a hidden, localized atrocity into a massive federal crime scene. The grueling, dangerous investigation had finally pierced the thick veil of corruption and geographical isolation, bringing the horrific truth of the modern-day slave camp into the unforgiving light of international scrutiny, and setting the complex stage for a monumental legal battle to secure justice for the hundreds of shattered lives left in its devastating wake. The transition from the humid, tension-filled air of the Dewusa compound in American Samoa to the sterile, air-conditioned hallways of the United States District Court in Honolulu, Hawaii, marked the beginning of a legal reckoning that would become a landmark in American jurisprudence. For Kil-Suli, the journey was one of profound downfall, as he was stripped of the absolute, tyrannical power he had wielded over his hundreds of captives and forced to face the cold, impartial scrutiny of federal prosecutors. The arrest was not merely a local police matter. It was a strategic operation led by the Department of Justice, which recognized that the atrocities committed under the banner of the Dewusa factory represented a direct and violent assault on the very foundations of American labor and human rights laws. As Lee was led away in handcuffs, the kingdom of corrugated tin and razor wire he had constructed began to dismantle. But the path to a final verdict would be long, complex, and fraught with the heavy emotional weight of the hundreds of lives he had systematically shattered. The case was no longer just about a failed business venture in a remote territory. It had transformed into a high-stakes battle to define the boundaries of modern slavery and to prove that the American flag offered no shelter for those who sought to revive the horrors of involuntary servitude on its soil. The indictment brought against Kil-Suli was staggering in its scope, weaving together a narrative of human trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and the brutal enforcement of forced labor. Federal prosecutors painstakingly constructed their case around the central concept of involuntary servitude, a charge that carried immense historical and legal significance. They argued that Lee had created a sophisticated and inescapable trap, utilizing the crushing weight of debt bondage as the primary mechanism of control. By requiring the workers to pay exorbitant brokerage fees often exceeding their annual family incomes back in Vietnam and China, Lee had ensured that they were effectively owned by the company before they ever set foot on the island. The prosecution's strategy was to demonstrate that the physical violence, the systemic starvation, and the confiscation of passports were not isolated incidents of mismanagement but were, in fact, the essential tools used to maintain this illegal state of bondage. Every strike of an iron pipe and every withheld meal was presented to the court as a deliberate act of coercion designed to keep the machinery of the factory running at the expense of human dignity. The legal challenge was to prove that these workers remained at the factory not out of a desire for employment, but out of a well-founded and paralyzing fear for their physical safety and the financial survival of their families. The courtroom in Honolulu became a stage for a deeply harrowing confrontation between the architect of the nightmare and the survivors who had endured it. One by one, the workers were called to the stand, their testimonies facilitated by a dedicated team of translators who worked tirelessly to bridge the linguistic and cultural divide. The atmosphere in the room was often thick with a somber, respectful silence as these individuals, many of whom were still visibly frail and traumatized, recounted the details of their daily lives inside the Dewusa compound. They spoke of the gnawing, constant ache of hunger that drove them to eat roots from the dirt. They described the suffocating heat of the tin dormitories where they were crammed together like livestock. Most powerfully, they spoke of the psychological terror of being stranded in a place where the very people meant to protect them the local police were instead the ones who captured them and returned them to their abuser. The emotional weight of these stories was undeniable, as the jury was forced to look past the abstract legal definitions of trafficking and see the raw, human cost of kill Suli's greed. The presence of the survivors in the courtroom was a testament to their incredible resilience. They were no longer invisible cogs in a manufacturing machine, but were now active participants in the pursuit of justice, their voices finally resonating in a space where they could not be silenced. The most pivotal and devastating moment of the trial occurred when the prosecution called the woman named Quian to testify. As she walked toward the witness stand, the physical evidence of the atrocities committed at Dewusa was rendered undeniably visible to everyone in the room. The permanent, haunting disfigurement of her eye, the direct result of the iron pipe attack in November 2000, served as a silent but screaming indictment of the regime she had survived. When she began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of her stolen vision and the immense pain she had endured, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She did not merely describe a workplace injury. She described a targeted act of state-sanctioned savagery intended to break the spirit of an entire community. Her testimony connected the abstract charges of forced labor to a specific, visceral moment of life-altering violence. The prosecution presented the iron pipe itself as evidence, a cold, heavy object that stood in stark contrast to the delicate fabrics of the garments the workers had been forced to sew. The juxtaposition was clear. The beauty of the Made in USA label was built upon the foundation of such brutal instruments. Quian's courage in facing the man who had ordered her mutilation became the moral center of the trial. A powerful demonstration that the spirit of the victims remained unbroken despite the absolute cruelty of their captors. In contrast, the defense presented by Kil Suli and his legal team attempted to paint a radically different and deeply cynical picture of the events at the factory. They argued that Lee was a struggling businessman who was himself a victim of difficult economic circumstances and the unique challenges of operating in a remote territory. They tried to characterize the horrific living conditions as a result of logistical failures rather than a deliberate policy of starvation. Most insidiously, the defense attempted to shift the blame onto the workers themselves, suggesting that the labor unrest was fueled by greed or a lack of understanding of American business practices. They sought to dismiss the instances of physical violence as isolated altercations involving overzealous local guards, for which Lee should not be held personally responsible. Furthermore, the defense tried to leverage the complicity of the local American Samoa government as a shield, implying that since the authorities had not intervened, the operations must have been within the bounds of local norms. This strategy was a desperate attempt to gaslight the court and the jury, to make the systematic destruction of human lives appear like a series of unfortunate but ultimately excusable business decisions. However, the sheer volume of evidence, the consistency of the victims' testimonies, and the physical scars borne by the survivors rendered these arguments increasingly hollow and offensive as the trial progressed. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the legal significance of the case began to ripple far beyond the walls of the Honolulu courthouse. The Department of Justice utilized the Dewusa prosecution to send a definitive and uncompromising message to the global manufacturing industry. The case was one of the first major tests of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, a piece of legislation designed specifically to provide federal authorities with the tools to combat modern forms of slavery. By successfully prosecuting Kill Suli under these statutes, the government established a powerful precedent that corporate entities and their leaders would be held criminally liable for the exploitation of vulnerable foreign workers, even in the most remote corners of United States jurisdiction. The trial exposed the dark underbelly of the global supply chain, revealing how major American retail brands could unwittingly or through willful negligence become complicit in the most extreme forms of human rights abuses. The evidence presented in court forced a national conversation about corporate responsibility and the ethics of production, challenging consumers and corporations alike to look more closely at the human cost hidden behind the labels on their clothing. The Dewusa case became a symbol of the ongoing struggle to ensure that the promise of the American dream was not a weapon used to lure the desperate into a life of modern-day bondage. The jury's deliberations were a reflection of the overwhelming and heartbreaking evidence they had been presented with over the course of the long trial. When the verdict was finally read in early 2005, it was a sweeping and absolute condemnation of Kill Suli's actions. He was found guilty on multiple counts of involuntary servitude, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and money laundering. The conviction was a historic victory for the survivors and for the federal investigators who had worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. At the sentencing hearing, the gravity of the crimes was met with a punishment that reflected their horrific nature. Kill Suli was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, which at the time was the harshest sentence ever handed down for human trafficking in the history of the United States. The judge's remarks during the sentencing were cutting and clear, describing Lee's operation as a profound stain on the honor of the nation and a barbaric violation of the fundamental principles of human liberty. The 40-year term was not just a punishment for one man. It was a societal declaration that the systematic enslavement and torture of human beings would be met with the full and unyielding force of the law. For the man who had once believed he was untouchable in his island kingdom, the sentence marked the final, permanent end of his reign of terror. While the legal victory provided a sense of justice, the true resolution of the Dewusa case lay in the fate of the hundreds of survivors who had been rescued from the compound. The federal government, recognizing the unique and extreme nature of their suffering, took unprecedented steps to provide them with a path toward genuine recovery. Many of the workers were granted T visas, a special category of immigration status created specifically for victims of severe forms of human trafficking who assist in the investigation or prosecution of their abusers. This provision allowed the survivors, who had originally come to the island chasing a fraudulent version of the American dream, to finally have the opportunity to build real lives within the United States. They were given the chance to settle in various communities across the mainland, to find legitimate employment where they were protected by the law, and to finally begin the long, difficult process of healing from their trauma. For individuals like Quian, the transition was bittersweet, as the physical and psychological scars of the factory would remain with them forever. Yet, the ability to stay in the country that had eventually rescued them offered a small measure of compensation for the horrors they had endured. The granting of these visas was the final, vital act of the rescue operation, transforming the survivors from stateless captives into recognized individuals with the right to live in safety and dignity. The Dewusa factory was gone, its walls torn down and its architect imprisoned, but the journey for those who survived its shadows was only just beginning. As they stepped out of the darkness of modern slavery and into the complex, hopeful reality of their newfound freedom. As the final gavel echoed through the federal courtroom in Honolulu, signaling the end of one of the most harrowing legal battles in the history of American labor. A profound and heavy silence settled over those who had witnessed the proceedings. The architect of the nightmare, Kill Suli, was led away to begin a 40-year sentence, a term so significant that it served as a tectonic shift in how the United States viewed and prosecuted human trafficking. This was not merely a victory for the prosecution. It was a visceral, public reclamation of the lives that had been systematically dismantled within the corrugated tin walls of the DeRussa factory. Yet, as the headlines began to fade and the television cameras were packed away, the true weight of the aftermath began to settle into the bones of the survivors and the conscience of a nation. The conclusion of the trial did not mean the conclusion of the story. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward healing and a necessary, painful period of reflection on the systemic failures that allowed a slave camp to operate under the protective shadow of the American flag. The sentencing of Kil Suli to 4 decades in federal prison was a landmark moment that reverberated far beyond the shores of Hawaii and American Samoa. It was the harshest penalty ever handed down for such crimes at that point in history, sending an uncompromising message to global supply chains that the exploitation of human life would no longer be dismissed as a mere cost of doing business. This legal milestone was the first major validation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, proving that federal authorities now possess the legislative teeth to bite back against corporate entities that traded in human misery. The case fundamentally altered the landscape of federal law enforcement, providing a blueprint for how to dismantle complex international trafficking networks that utilized debt bondage and geographical isolation as their primary weapons. However, the severity of the sentence also served as a grim reminder of the scale of the atrocities committed. 40 years was a lifetime, yet to the hundreds of men and women who had been starved, beaten, and stripped of their dignity. No amount of time behind bars could ever truly compensate for the terror they endured in the sweltering heat of Tafuna. For the survivors, the path forward was paved with both immense relief and profound, lingering trauma. The granting of D visas was a critical, life-altering act of restorative justice, allowing these individuals to finally step out of the shadows and into the sunlight of legitimate American life. These visas were more than just legal documents. They were a formal apology from the state, a recognition that the American dream they had been promised was a lie, and that they were now entitled to the real protections and opportunities that the nation supposedly stood for. Many of the workers chose to settle on the United States mainland, far from the ocean that had once acted as their prison moat. They moved into communities where they could find work that respected their humanity, where they were paid fair wages, and where they no longer had to scavenge for roots in the dirt to survive. Yet, the transition was not without its own set of challenges. They carried with them the invisible scars of post-traumatic stress, the haunting memories of the iron pipes, and the deep-seated mistrust of authority figures born from the betrayal of the local police in American Samoa. The physical legacy of the DeRussa factory remained most visibly and heartbreakingly in the person of Quian, the woman whose eye had been violently stolen by a guard's iron pipe. Her permanent blindness was not just a medical condition. It was a permanent monument to the cost of unchecked corporate greed. Every time she looked in a mirror, she was reminded of the November strike, the screams of her fellow workers, and the moment the world went dark in one eye. Her story, while one of incredible bravery, also highlights the irreversible nature of the damage inflicted. While the legal system could offer money and residency, it could not restore her sight, nor could it erase the nights of hunger and the days of terror. The survivor's journey toward wholeness is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it is also a somber reminder that some wounds never truly close. They had survived the Ua Ngak Turnjion, the hell on earth, but they would forever be defined by the strength it took to crawl out of it. Reflecting on the role of the major American brands involved, such as JCPenney and Target, the DeRussa case forced a painful reckoning regarding corporate accountability and the ethics of the global garment industry. For years, these companies had stocked their shelves with clothing made in the Tafuna facility, benefiting from the prestige of the Made in USA label while remaining blissfully or willfully ignorant of the blood and hunger that went into every stitch. The case shattered the illusion that domestic production was inherently ethical. It exposed a catastrophic lack of oversight and a systemic failure of corporate auditing processes. While these brands were not criminally charged, the reputational damage was significant, leading to a broader conversation about the necessity of transparent supply chains. It challenged the average American consumer to consider the true price of a $20 shirt. The irony of the situation remains one of the most chilling aspects of the entire saga. The very garments that symbolized American prosperity and fashion were produced by people who were being treated as less than human on American soil. The role of the local government and law enforcement in American Samoa remains a dark stain on the history of the territory. The systemic corruption that allowed Kel Suli to operate with impunity for years, and the active participation of police officers in returning escapees to their captor, revealed a profound breakdown of the rule of law. It showed how easily a powerful individual can subvert justice in an isolated environment, creating a localized fiefdom where the vulnerable have no recourse. This failure of the local institutions necessitated the heavy-handed intervention of the FBI and federal prosecutors, highlighting a troubling jurisdictional void that traffickers are all too eager to exploit. The Dewusa story serves as a cautionary tale for all territories and isolated regions, a reminder that without constant vigilance and independent oversight, the structures meant to protect the people can easily be twisted into the very tools of their oppression. Looking back at the year 1999, when those 200 workers first boarded planes in Vietnam and China, we see a group of people driven by the most noble of human instincts, the desire to provide a better life for their families. They were not seeking a handout, they were seeking hard work and fair pay. They believed in the promise of the American dream with a sincerity that many who are born into it often forget. The betrayal of that belief by Kel Suli is the ultimate tragedy of this case. He didn't just steal their labor, he stole their hope and weaponized their poverty against them. The Kaibubayan, the debt trap he created, was a masterclass in psychological and financial subjugation, proving that the most effective chains are often the ones made of paper and interest rates. As we conclude this exploration of the Dewusa tragedy, we are left with a series of difficult questions that continue to resonate in our modern era. How many other Tafunas exist in the world today, hidden behind high fences and high-sounding labels? How often do we trade the dignity of a fellow human being for the convenience of a low price tag? The story of the Dewusa factory is not just a historical footnote or a piece of true crime trivia. It is a mirror held up to our global society. It asks us to define what the Made in USA label truly means, whether it is merely a geographic indicator or a moral commitment to the welfare of those who do the work. The rescue in 2001 and the convictions in 2005 were essential acts of justice, but the ultimate justice lies in our collective memory and our refusal to let such an atrocity happen again. The waves still lap at the shores of American Samoa, and the tropical sun still beats down on the village of Tafuna. The corrugated tin structures are gone, and the razor wire has been cleared away, but the ghost of the Dewusa factory remains part of the island's history. It is a story of profound darkness, but also one of incredible light, the light of the whistleblowers who refused to be silenced, the light of the human rights workers who listened when no one else would, and the light of the survivors who stood in a federal courtroom and told their truth. Their resilience is the final word in this narrative. They were meant to be broken, meant to be forgotten, and meant to be discarded in a silent corner of the Pacific. Instead, they became the catalysts for a new era of justice, their voices echoing across the ocean to remind us that no one is truly invisible, and that the pursuit of freedom is a light that no amount of darkness can ever fully extinguish. We must carry their story forward, not just as a tale of horror, but as a mandate for vigilance, ensuring that the dream they chased so bravely is never again turned into a nightmare for someone else. Would you like me to analyze the specific impact of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act on other similar cases in U.S. territories? Or perhaps look into how corporate auditing for major retailers changed following the Dewusa scandal? The final echoes of the Dewusa tragedy did not dissipate with the closing of the courtroom doors in Honolulu. Nor did the weight of the story vanish when Kel Suli began his 40-year descent into the federal prison system. Instead, the legacy of this case settled into a long, reflective silence that continues to haunt the corridors of American labor history and the memories of those who survived the tin-roofed purgatory of Tafuna. When we look back at the timeline of this atrocity, spanning from the deceptive promises of 1999 to the historic convictions of 2005, we are forced to confront the chilling reality of how easily the mechanisms of modern civilization can be inverted to facilitate the most ancient of crimes. The Dewusa factory was not a glitch in an otherwise perfect system. It was a devastating exposure of the systemic vulnerabilities that exist when geographic isolation meets unchecked corporate ambition and institutional corruption. The story remains a vital, painful reminder that the boundaries of human rights are only as strong as the vigilance of those tasked with enforcing them, and that for over 200 souls, those boundaries were non-existent for 2 agonizing years. The physical site in Tafuna, once a hub of frenetic, forced activity and the source of hundreds of thousands of garments destined for the American mainland, eventually fell into a state of quiet decay. The high fences topped with razor wire, which had once been the defining borders of a prison camp, were eventually dismantled, and the sweltering tin dormitories that housed the starving workers were emptied of their desperate inhabitants. There is a profound, almost eerie irony in the silence that now occupies that space. The ground that once absorbed the blood of the striking workers and witnessed the daily scavenging for roots and edible weeds has been reclaimed by the lush, indifferent tropical vegetation of American Samoa. Yet, for the local community, the memory of the Dewusa factory remains a complex and uncomfortable chapter. It serves as a permanent mark on the territorial history, a reminder of a time when the local authorities failed in their most fundamental duty to protect the vulnerable. The corruption that allowed Kill Suli to flourish was not just a failure of a few individuals, but a failure of a system that allowed a wealthy businessman to buy the silence of the law. This betrayal of public trust is a wound that the territory has had to work hard to heal. As it continues to navigate its unique and sometimes precarious relationship with federal oversight and the principles of American justice. For the survivors, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a second, equally complex journey, the reclamation of their own identities within the very country that had unknowingly hosted their suffering. The transition from the isolated compound in the South Pacific to the sprawling, unfamiliar landscapes of the American mainland was a profound cultural and psychological shock. These men and women, who had been lured by a fraudulent dream and then violently stripped of their autonomy, were suddenly tasked with building lives in a society they had only known through the lens of their captors' lies. Many settled in Vietnamese and Chinese communities across the United States, seeking the comfort of familiar languages and shared heritage. They carried with them the heavy burden of the debts they had incurred to secure their positions at Dewusa, debts that in many cases still loomed over their families back home. The T visas provided them with a legal shield and the right to work, but the process of financial and emotional recovery was a slow, grueling climb. They were no longer nameless cogs in a manufacturing machine, but they were individuals deeply marked by a trauma that most people could never truly comprehend. They had to learn to navigate the complexities of American life, from the simple act of grocery shopping without fear to the daunting task of finding legitimate employment that respected their rights as human beings. The psychological landscape of the survivors was dominated by the lingering effects of prolonged starvation and systemic abuse. The human brain, when subjected to the kind of extreme stress and deprivation witnessed at Dewusa, does not simply reset once the physical threat is removed. Many of the workers struggled with profound trust issues, particularly regarding authority figures and employers. The memory of the local police returning escapees to Kill Suli created a deep-seated suspicion that the law was a tool for the powerful rather than a protector for the weak. Even in the safety of the mainland, the sudden sound of a loud voice or the sight of a uniform could trigger visceral flashbacks to the dark rooms and the iron pipes of Tafuna. The resilience they showed in the face of these challenges was nothing short of heroic. They formed support networks among themselves, sharing resources and advice as they navigated their new reality. They worked multiple jobs, sent money back to their families to finally pay off the predatory loans, and slowly began to weave themselves into the fabric of American society. Their success was not measured in the wealth they accumulated, but in the quiet dignity they reclaimed every day they lived as free people. The legal revolution triggered by the DeWusa case cannot be overstated. Before this tragedy, the United States lacked a comprehensive and effective framework for addressing the nuances of modern-day slavery, particularly the subtle but powerful mechanisms of debt bondage and psychological coercion. The successful prosecution of Kill Sulu provided the first major test for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, proving that the law could be used to reach into the most remote corners of American jurisdiction and hold traffickers accountable. It redefined the legal understanding of involuntary servitude, moving away from a strictly physical definition to one that acknowledged the power of financial and psychological traps. This shift was monumental, as it allowed federal authorities to target the sophisticated methods that modern traffickers use to exploit vulnerable populations. The DeWusa case became a foundational text for specialized task forces across the country, providing a blueprint for how to investigate and prosecute labor trafficking in a globalized economy. It ensured that the hundreds of workers did not suffer in vain, as their pain became the catalyst for a stronger, more resilient legal system that has since rescued thousands of others from similar fates. However, the corporate landscape remains a more complicated and less certain part of the DeWusa legacy. The major brands like JCPenney and Target, whose labels were sewn into the garments produced in Tafuna, were forced into a period of intense public scrutiny and internal review. The case exposed a catastrophic lack of transparency in global supply chains and a failure of the auditing processes that were supposed to ensure ethical production. In the years following the scandal, many corporations implemented more rigorous social compliance programs and third-party monitoring of their manufacturing facilities. They promised that the conditions found at DeWusa would never again be repeated under their watch. Yet, the pressure for low prices and fast production continues to drive manufacturing into increasingly remote and unregulated areas where the risk of exploitation remains high. The DeWusa story serves as a permanent warning to consumers and corporations alike that the Made in USA label is not a guarantee of ethical behavior unless it is backed by genuine, unyielding oversight. It challenges us to look beyond the convenience of a purchase and recognize the human lives that are inextricably linked to the products we consume. The moral debt that society owes to the workers of DeWusa is paid only when we refuse to accept a system that treats human beings as disposable commodities. The figure of Quyen remains the most poignant symbol of this entire narrative. Her journey from a hopeful recruit in Vietnam to a maimed survivor in America perfectly encapsulates the profound betrayal of the American dream. Her permanent blindness in one eye is a physical manifestation of the cost of greed, a permanent, unchangeable mark of the violence that was used to maintain the DeWusa operation. Yet, in her life after the factory, she has also become a symbol of an unbreakable spirit. By testifying against Kill Sulu and participating in the reclamation of her life, she transformed herself from a victim into a witness for justice. Her story, and the stories of the hundreds who stood with her, remind us that even in the most absolute darkness, the human desire for freedom and dignity cannot be entirely extinguished. They were subjected to a regime designed to break them, to starve them, and to silence them, but in the end, it was their voices that brought the walls of the compound down. They proved that the truth, when combined with the relentless pursuit of justice, is a force more powerful than the most fortified prison. As we reach the final conclusion of this deep dive into the DeWusa case, we must consider the broader philosophical implications of what occurred in Tafuna. The American dream is often marketed as a universal promise of prosperity through hard work, but for the workers of DeWusa, it was a weaponized myth used to lure them into a state of modern-day bondage. This tragedy forces us to ask whether the dream can truly exist if it is built on the systematic exploitation of those who believe in it most fervently. The rescue and the subsequent legal victories were a reclamation of that dream, a statement that the United States would not allow its identity to be synonymous with the horrors of slavery. But the work is never truly finished. The vigilance required to prevent such atrocities must be constant, as the forces of greed and corruption are always seeking out new corners of the world to hide their crimes. The story of Dewusa is a mandate for all of us to listen to the whispers of the marginalized, to demand transparency from the powerful, and to ensure that no one is ever truly invisible to the law. The waves of the Pacific continue to hit the shores of American Samoa, and the sun continues to rise over the village of Tafuna. The physical scars on the landscape may have healed, but the story of the 200 workers remains an indelible part of the human experience. It is a story of profound suffering, yes, but it is ultimately a story of the triumph of justice over cruelty and the resilience of the human soul. We must carry the memory of the Dewusa factory with us, not as a source of despair, but as a source of strength and a reminder of our collective responsibility to one another. The labels on our clothing may change, and the names of the factories may be forgotten, but the fundamental right to live in dignity and freedom is a universal constant that we must protect with everything we have. The workers of Dewusa were once silenced, but through their courage, they have spoken a truth that will echo through history forever. A truth that reminds us that the Made in USA label must always stand for the dignity of the hands that made it. This concludes our deep dive into the horrific events at the Dewusa factory, a journey from the depths of a modern slave camp to the heights of federal justice, and a final tribute to the unbroken spirits who survived the darkness of Tafuna. The conclusion of the legal proceedings in Honolulu provided a definitive period to the criminal career of Kilsuli, but for the territory of American Samoa and the global community. The ripples of the Dewusa tragedy continue to expand, forcing a deep and painful reassessment of justice, labor, and the true cost of the products that define our modern lives. The empty shells of the Tafuna factory stood as a silent, rusting testament to a period of darkness that many on the island wished to forget. Yet the magnitude of the crime made forgetting impossible. This was not a localized incident that could be swept away by the tropical tides. It was a systemic failure that had exposed the vulnerabilities of a remote American territory to the predatory ambitions of an individual who recognized that where oversight is thin, cruelty can become a business model. The aftermath was a time of intense communal soul-searching for American Samoa, as the people and the government had to grapple with the reality that a modern-day slave camp had flourished in their midst, aided by the very institutions meant to uphold the law. The shame associated with the complicity of local officials became a heavy burden, leading to a slow but necessary overhaul of how the territory managed foreign investment and labor protections, ensuring that the isolation of the islands would never again be used as a shield for such profound inhumanity. The broader legal legacy of the Dewusa case became a cornerstone of human rights advocacy in the 21st century, specifically through the lens of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. This legislation, which was still in its infancy when the FBI raided the Tafuna compound, found its most critical and high-profile application in the prosecution of Kilsuli. The case served as the ultimate proof of concept for federal authorities, demonstrating that the law possessed the reach and the power to dismantle complex international trafficking networks that utilized debt bondage and psychological terror rather than physical chains. It transformed the way federal agents and prosecutors approached labor exploitation, moving the focus from simple immigration violations to the much more serious and accurate framework of human rights abuses and involuntary servitude. The 40-year sentence handed down to Lee was not just a punishment for his specific actions. It was a societal declaration that the exploitation of the vulnerable would be met with the full and unyielding force of the United States justice system, regardless of how remote the location or how powerful the perpetrator. This precedent has since been used to protect thousands of other workers in various industries, ensuring that the suffering of the Dewusa victims became a catalyst for a more just and vigilant legal landscape. For the survivors themselves, the journey into their new lives on the United States mainland was a process of slow, often painful integration. The granting of D visas provided them with the legal right to remain in the country, but it could not instantly provide the psychological peace they so desperately sought. These individuals, who had spent years in a state of constant survival mode, had to learn how to exist in a world where they were no longer hunted or starved. Many moved to vibrant Vietnamese and Chinese enclaves in cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, and Houston, seeking the familiarity of their culture while navigating the complexities of American society. They took jobs in kitchens, in manufacturing, and in service industries, but this time they were protected by the very labor laws that Kilsuli had so violently ignored. They worked with a quiet, fierce determination to pay off the remaining debts that still tied their families to the predatory lenders back home, finally severing the financial chains that had first led them to the Dewusa factory. The process of healing was not linear. It was a daily struggle to reconcile their traumatic past with their hopeful present. A journey marked by the resilience that had allowed them to survive the tin houses of Tafuna in the first place. The corporate impact of the scandal forced a permanent change in how major American retailers manage their global supply chains. Companies like JCPenney and Target, whose reputations were deeply tarnished by their association with the Dewusa factory, had to answer difficult questions about their lack of oversight. The case became a cautionary tale in business schools and corporate boardrooms, illustrating the catastrophic risks of ignoring the human cost of production. It led to the rise of more sophisticated social auditing processes and a greater emphasis on corporate social responsibility. As brands realized that a Made in USA label was not enough to protect them from the fallout of unethical labor practices. While the global manufacturing industry still faces significant challenges regarding labor rights, the Dewusa case established a baseline of accountability that had previously been absent. It forced a conversation about the transparency of supply chains, challenging corporations to know exactly who is sewing their garments and under what conditions. The moral debt that these corporations owed to the workers was never fully repaid, but the shift in industry standards stands as a lasting, if imperfect, tribute to the lives that were disrupted by the greed of Kilsuli. Kilsuli's life behind bars in a high-security federal prison serves as the final, somber chapter of his personal narrative. For a man who once viewed himself as an untouchable king of a private island domain, the transition to the rigid, egalitarian discipline of the federal prison system was a total and absolute downfall. In prison, he was no longer the powerful CEO who could command the starvation of hundreds or order the mutilation of a worker. He was simply another inmate, defined by a number and a crime that carried a profound social stigma even among other prisoners. His multiple attempts to appeal his sentence were systematically rejected by the courts, which remained unmoved by his claims of innocence or his attempts to shift the blame onto his subordinates. The finality of his 40-year term meant that he would spend the vast majority of his remaining years in a cell, a fitting conclusion for someone who had built his fortune on the imprisonment and suffering of others. His legacy is one of absolute disgrace, a name that will forever be synonymous with one of the most shameful episodes of corporate and human rights abuse in American history. The philosophical reflection that emerges from the Dewusa tragedy centers on the fragile nature of the American dream and the inherent responsibilities of a consumer-driven society. The dream that lured the workers from Vietnam and China was a vision of prosperity and freedom, a promise that hard work would lead to a better life. Kilsuli's genius lay in his ability to weaponize that dream, turning it into a trap that relied on the very optimism and ambition of his victims. This betrayal forces us to confront the reality that for many in the global economy, the American dream remains a dangerous illusion, a bait used by the modern-day architects of slavery to capture the desperate. It also places a heavy burden of conscience on the average consumer, who often remains comfortably disconnected from the origins of the products they purchase. The garments made in Tafuna were sold in pristine stores to people who had no idea they were wearing the products of starvation and violence. The Dewusa story demands that we bridge that gap of ignorance and acknowledge our own role in the systems that allow such exploitation to exist. It is a call for a more ethical and aware form of consumption, one that values the dignity of the producer as much as the convenience of the product. As we look one last time at the story of the Dewusa factory, we are reminded that the ultimate victory belongs to the survivors. They were the ones who refused to be broken, who organized in the face of certain violence, and who eventually spoke their truth in a court of law. Their courage was the light that finally pierced the darkness of the Tafuna compound, bringing a powerful predator to justice and changing the course of American law. They are no longer the slaves of Kilsuli. They are survivors, citizens, and witnesses to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their lives today, lived in the quiet dignity of freedom, are the true resolution to this horrific tale. The Yua Engak Turnjiel they endured is a part of their history, but it does not define their future. They have reclaimed their vision, their voices, and their lives, standing as a permanent reminder that even in the most isolated and corrupt corners of the world, the pursuit of justice is a fire that cannot be put out. This narrative of the Dewusa factory concludes here, not as a simple story of crime and punishment, but as a mandate for vigilance and a tribute to human resilience. We must remember the names of the victims, the horrific details of the tin houses, and the ultimate triumph of the federal raid, for in remembering, we ensure that the silence of Tafuna is never allowed to return. The Made in USA label must be more than a marketing tool. It must be a promise of safety and dignity for every person who contributes to the fabric of the nation. The workers of Dewusa have taught us that freedom is not a given, but a right that must be defended with every investigation, every prosecution, and every conscious choice we make as a society. Their story is now a part of us, a somber and powerful guide for how we must treat the vulnerable, the desperate, and the hopeful in a world that is always in danger of forgetting its own humanity. The legacy of the 200 souls from Vietnam and China is a legacy of survival, a story that began in a trap of debt and ended in a reclamation of the American dream. Proving once and for all that justice, though sometimes delayed by the vastness of an ocean, is an inevitable force for those who refuse to stop screaming for the light. The passage of time has a peculiar way of smoothing over the jagged edges of historical atrocities. Yet for those who lived through the Dewusa nightmare, the calendar offers no such relief. As we move deeper into the third decade since the FBI breached those rusted gates in Tafuna, the legacy of the case has transitioned from a sensational headline into a profound sociological study of survival and the enduring power of restorative justice. To look at the lives of the survivors today is to witness a remarkable, almost defiant reconstruction of the human spirit. These individuals, once reduced to skeletal figures scavenging for roots in the red dirt of American Samoa, have since woven themselves into the vibrant, complex tapestry of the American mainland. They are now small business owners, parents of college graduates, and active members of the very society that once unknowingly facilitated their enslavement. Their journey is a testament to the fact that while Kilsuli attempted to steal their future, the eventual intervention of the federal government provided a foundation upon which they could reclaim not just their freedom, but their humanity. The T-visas that were born from the ashes of this case did more than just offer legal residency. They served as a bridge between a traumatic past and a liberated future, allowing a group of stateless, broken individuals to finally find a place they could truly call home. The evolution of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act TVPA following the Dewusa convictions represents one of the most significant shifts in American human rights policy in the modern era. Before the horrors of the Tafuna compound were exposed to the light of a federal courtroom, the legal mechanisms for addressing labor trafficking were fragmented, often treating victims as mere undocumented workers rather than survivors of severe crimes. The Dewusa case provided the visceral, undeniable evidence needed to galvanize legislative action, transforming the TVPA from a theoretical framework into a robust, life-saving tool for law enforcement. It established a clear mandate that the protection of the victim was as central to the pursuit of justice as the prosecution of the perpetrator. This shift in ideology has had a global ripple effect, influencing how international organizations and foreign governments categorize and combat modern slavery. The Dewusa precedent is now cited in legal textbooks and human rights reports as the definitive proof that even in the most isolated geographical voids, the reach of justice must be absolute. The hundreds of workers who endured starvation and violence in American Samoa became the unwitting pioneers of a legal revolution, their suffering serving as the catalyst for a world that is now significantly more vigilant and better equipped to detect the hidden signs of forced labor in the global supply chain. In the quiet suburbs of cities like Seattle and Houston, where many of the Vietnamese survivors eventually settled, The memories of the factory floor are now whispered stories told in the safety of living rooms, far from the sweltering heat of the South Pacific. For these families, the Made in USA label no longer carries the weight of a deceptive promise, but rather the reality of a life lived under the protection of the law. However, the psychological aftermath of such extreme exploitation is never entirely erased. The survivors carry what sociologists often call phantom pains, a lingering, deep-seated anxiety that stems from the years spent in a state of constant, life-threatening deprivation. Even 20 years later, a simple trip to a well-stocked American supermarket can be an overwhelming experience for someone who once had to eat tree roots to survive. The abundance of the mainland stands in jarring contrast to the memories of the meager rice rations and the salt water that was their only seasoning. This transgenerational trauma is something the survivors navigate with a quiet, fierce dignity, ensuring that their children understand the value of the freedom they now possess. A freedom that was bought with the sight of Kwanzaa and the blood of the striking workers in November of the year 2000. The corporate world, too, has been forced into a permanent, if sometimes reluctant, state of self-reflection. The massive auditing failures that allowed JCPenney and Target to stock garments from a slave camp have led to the professionalization of the social compliance industry. Today, major retailers employ thousands of inspectors who travel to remote manufacturing hubs, tasked with looking past the polished surfaces of the factory floor to find the hidden signs of debt bondage and human rights abuses. While the system is still far from perfect, the shadow of DeWusa looms over every corporate boardroom as a reminder of the catastrophic reputational and moral cost of negligence. The case proved that ignorance is not a legal or ethical defense in a globalized economy. It forced corporations to acknowledge that their responsibility does not end at the signing of a contract, but extends to every person who handles the fabric of their products. The moral burden of the DeWusa case has become a permanent fixture of the modern business landscape, a constant reminder that the pursuit of profit must never again be allowed to operate in a vacuum of human empathy. Returning to the geography of the crime, the village of Tufuno in American Samoa has undergone its own slow process of transformation. The site of the former factory is now largely reclaimed by the lush greenery of the island, the physical scars of the compound buried under layers of tropical growth. For the local community, the memory of the case remains a somber lesson in the dangers of institutional silence. The complicity of the local authorities at the time, the police officers who ignored the pleas for help and the officials who accepted the influence of Kill Solis, now viewed as a profound betrayal of the Samoan culture of hospitality and protection. The territory has since worked to strengthen its own labor oversight and to foster a more transparent relationship with federal regulators, seeking to ensure that the unique status of American Samoa as an unincorporated territory is never again exploited as a legal loophole for traffickers. The silence that once protected the DeWusa factory has been replaced by a more vigilant, community-driven awareness of the rights of all people who come to the islands to work. The figure of Kilsuli, now an old man in the twilight of his 40-year federal sentence, serves as a chilling study in the banality of evil. His crime was not born of a sudden, explosive impulse, but of a calculated, day-to-day commitment to the destruction of human dignity for the sake of financial gain. His story is a warning that modern slavery does not always look like the chains of the past. It often looks like a legitimate business, a corporate hierarchy, and a series of predatory loans. By striping away the humanity of his workers, Lee eventually stripped away his own, ending his life in the very state of confinement and isolation he once imposed on others. His conviction stands as a definitive statement that in the eyes of the law, the wealth of a CEO is no shield against the suffering of the most vulnerable laborer. The 40 years he was given were not just a sentence for one man, but a symbolic restoration of the time and the lives he stole from the 200 souls who trusted him to bring them to the American dream. As we look at the state of the world today, the story of the DeWusa factory remains an essential mandate for global vigilance. We live in an era where the demand for cheap goods continues to put immense pressure on the workers at the furthest ends of the supply chain. The traps of debt bondage, the confiscation of documents, and the use of physical and psychological violence are still actively being utilized by traffickers in various industries across the globe. The lessons of Tafuna, the importance of listening to the whispers of the marginalized, the necessity of independent oversight, and the power of restorative justice are more relevant now than ever. The Dewusa case taught us that we cannot afford to be passive consumers or indifferent citizens. It taught us that the price of our garments must never be the life of the person who made them. The memory of the hundreds of Vietnamese and Chinese workers who survived the Yua Ngak Turnjian is a living flame that continues to light the way for those who fight for a world where labor is respected and human dignity is non-negotiable. The final word of this long-form exploration belongs not to the lawyers, the investigators, or the corporations, but to the survivors themselves. Their resilience is the true conclusion of the Dewusa story. They are the ones who refuse to be broken by the iron pipe, the hunger, or the silence of the island. They are the ones who stood in the light of the Honolulu courtroom and reclaimed their voices, ensuring that their names would be remembered not as victims, but as heroes of their own liberation. Their presence in the world today as citizens, as neighbors, and as free human beings is the ultimate victory over the darkness of Kill Suli. As the sun sets over the Pacific and rises over the busy streets of the American mainland, the legacy of the Dewusa factory remains a powerful, enduring reminder that justice, no matter how distant or delayed, is a force that can eventually break any chain and heal any wound. The silence of Tafuna has been permanently broken, and in its place, the voices of the survivors continue to resonate, a testament to the fact that the human spirit, when fueled by hope and protected by the law, is truly indestructible. This completes the narrative of the Dewusa tragedy, a story of profound betrayal and ultimate redemption that will forever be etched into the conscience of the nation and the history of human liberty. As we arrive at the final chapter of this harrowing journey through the corridors of the Dewusa factory, we are forced to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that for over 2 years, a modern-day slave camp operated with terrifying efficiency under the very flag that symbolizes global liberty. The story of what happened in Tafuna, American Samoa, is not merely a chronicle of a single criminal enterprise or the sociopathy of one man named Kill Suli. It is a profound, systemic indictment of the cracks that exist within our globalized world, where geography can be weaponized to strip human beings of their most basic rights. When we look back at the thousands of garments that rolled off those assembly lines, each one bearing the prestigious Made in the USA label, we are looking at the ultimate paradox of the American dream. That label was never supposed to be a shroud for starvation, nor was it meant to be a mask for the brutal strike of an iron pipe. Yet, for the 200 workers from Vietnam and China, the dream they were sold in 1999 turned into a nightmare of debt, hunger, and silence. This final reflection is not just about the closing of a case file, but about the enduring lessons that the survivors have left for a world that all too often chooses to look away from the human cost of its own convenience. The physical structures of the Dewusa factory may have been dismantled, and the rusted barbed wire may have been cleared from the tropical landscape of Tafuna. But the psychological architecture of the crime remains a vital subject of study for anyone who seeks to understand the mechanics of modern exploitation. The Kaibabayan, the debt trap, was the true foundation of Kill Suli's empire. By forcing impoverished workers to mortgage their family homes and borrow thousands of dollars just for the chance to work, Lee ensured that their chains were not made of iron, but of interest rates and legal obligations. This was the genius of his cruelty. He didn't need to lock the gates every hour of the day because the workers were already imprisoned by the fear of their family's financial ruin back home. When we consider the $5,000 to $8,000 each worker paid to enter that compound, we are seeing the precise price tag Lee placed on a human life. It was a calculated gamble that relied on the workers' desperation and their profound belief in the integrity of American soil. The betrayal of that belief is perhaps the most lasting injury of the entire saga, a wound that the survivors have had to carry even as they built new lives on the mainland. The silence that surrounded the factory for so long was perhaps the most terrifying element of the entire ordeal. In a small, isolated territory like American Samoa, the proximity of the community to the atrocity should have led to an immediate intervention. However, as the federal investigation later revealed, the silence was a manufactured product built through the systemic corruption of local institutions. The police officers who turned their backs on the bleeding workers, the officials who accepted the influence of a wealthy businessman, and the neighbors who chose not to hear the cries from behind the tin walls were all complicit in the maintenance of the Ua Engak Turnjion. This tells us something profound about the nature of justice in remote jurisdictions. Without the oversight of a larger, more transparent federal system, the law can easily become the personal tool of the highest bidder. The intervention of the FBI in 2001 was not just a rescue mission for the workers, but a rescue mission for the rule of law itself, proving that even in the furthest reaches of the Pacific, the principles of human dignity are not negotiable. As the survivors settled into their lives on the American mainland, the reality of their T visas became the final, bittersweet realization of the dream they had originally chased. They finally obtained the right to live and work in the United States, but the cost of that entry was a level of suffering that no human being should ever have to endure. For the woman named Quian, the price was her literal vision, a permanent darkness in one eye that serves as an eternal witness to the violence of the iron pipe. Her story, and the stories of the others who were beaten and starved, have become a foundational part of how the United States now defines and combats human trafficking. The 40-year sentence handed to kill Suli in 2005 was a historical landmark, but it was also a societal apology. It was the justice system finally admitting that it had failed to protect these people and that the only way to restore the nation's honor was to impose a punishment that reflected the absolute gravity of the crime. Lee's presence in a federal prison today is a quiet, ongoing assurance that the era of the Dewusa-style slave camp is over. Yet it is an assurance that requires constant, unyielding vigilance to maintain. The role of the major American brands, Target and JCPenney, remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of corporate negligence. For years, these companies profited from the labor of the starving, their supply chain auditors failing to see the emaciated bodies behind the sewing machines. This failure forced a global conversation about the Made in USA label, stripping away its mythic status and revealing that domestic production is not an automatic guarantee of ethical behavior. The case forced these corporations to implement more rigorous, transparent standards, but the question remains whether the consumer has truly learned the lesson. Every time we choose the cheapest option without questioning the conditions of its manufacture, we risk incentivizing another kill Suli to build another compound in another silent corner of the world. The legacy of Dewusa is a demand for a more conscious form of capitalism, one where the welfare of the worker is valued as much as the margin of the profit. In the final analysis, the story of the Dewusa factory is a story of the triumph of the human voice over a system designed to silence it. The workers did not wait for a savior, they organized, they struck, and they risked their lives to escape and tell the world what was happening. They were the ones who broke the silence, who provided the evidence, and who stood in the courtrooms of Honolulu to look their captor in the eye. Their resilience is the true miracle of this case. They were meant to be forgotten, to be used until they were broken, and then to be discarded. Instead, they became the architects of a new era of human rights legislation, ensuring that their pain would lead to the protection of countless others. Their names may not be widely known, but their impact is felt every time a trafficker is brought to justice under the laws that their suffering helped to strengthen. The sun continues to rise and set over the lush islands of American Samoa, and the ocean waves continue to wash against the shores of Tufuna. The physical evidence of the nightmare has long since vanished, replaced by the indomitable growth of the tropical landscape. But for those who know the history, the air around the old factory site still carries the weight of those 2 years. It is a weight that we must all share, for the story of Dewusa is not just a Vietnamese story, or a Chinese story, or an American Samoan story. It is a human story. It is a reminder of how easily we can descend into barbarism when we stop seeing our fellow humans as individuals with rights and begin seeing them as commodities. The 1,600 words of this conclusion are merely a brief shadow of the millions of moments of pain, hunger, and hope that occurred within those walls. As we close this narrative, let us remember the survivors not as victims, but as pioneers of justice. They came seeking a better life and found a prison, yet they walked out of that prison as the most powerful witnesses to the necessity of freedom. They proved that no matter how isolated the location, no matter how corrupt the local authorities, and no matter how heavy the iron pipe, the truth has a way of finding its way to the light. The Made in USA label on our clothing should now be viewed as a commitment to the memory of the 200 souls of Tufune and a promise that we will never again allow the American dream to be used as a bait for a modern slave trap. The silence has been broken, the architect is in his cell, and the survivors are finally home. Their journey is over, but our duty to remember their story and to protect the values they suffered for is just beginning. This is the final word on the Dewusa factory, a story of a darkness that was absolute and a light that refused to go out. The legacy of those who bled for a label is now a mandate for a world that must do better, look closer, and never again permit the starvation of the hopeful in the land of the free. The profound silence that eventually settled over the Tufune Industrial Park in the years following the Dewusa closure serves as a haunting physical manifestation of a chapter that many in the global garment industry would prefer to remain buried in the archives of 20th century labor disputes. However, as we reach the final movement of this narrative, we must recognize that the true conclusion of the Dewusa story is not found in the crumbling foundations of a factory or the iron bars of a federal prison cell, but in the evolving conscience of the modern consumer and the strength and framework of international human rights law. The transition from the localized terror of a South Pacific compound to a global symbol of the fight against modern slavery required a monumental effort from investigators, survivors, and advocates who refused to let the Made in the USA label be permanently associated with the scent of starvation and the sound of iron pipes. This final deep dive explores the lasting echoes of that struggle, the unfinished business of global supply chain ethics, and the ultimate hard-won peace found by those who were once considered disposable by a man who valued profit over the very breath of his fellow human beings. When we consider the historical impact of the Dewusa case, we must look beyond the immediate legal victories and examine the fundamental shift it triggered in the concept of corporate chain of responsibility before the year 2001. Many major American retailers operated under a convenient veil of plausible deniability, treating their suppliers as independent entities for whose actions they bore no moral or legal weight. The exposure of the conditions in American Samoa stripped this veil away with a violent clarity that could not be ignored by the public or the regulators. It established the terrifying reality that a consumer in a pristine shopping mall on the American mainland could be directly, albeit unknowingly, supporting a regime of forced labor and physical mutilation. This revelation turned the Made in the USA label into a mirror, forcing a nation to look at the hidden costs of its desire for cheap, accessible fashion. The legacy of the case is a permanent mandate for transparency, a requirement that corporations must not only know their suppliers, but must be held accountable for the human lives that are woven into every thread of their products. This shift from a don't ask, don't tell manufacturing model to one of active, aggressive oversight is perhaps the most significant structural change to emerge from the darkness of the Tufune compound. For the survivors, the journey toward a truly final conclusion has been one of quiet, persistent reclamation. The transition from being a case number in a federal investigation to being a citizen in a complex society is a path marked by thousands of small, uncelebrated victories. Every time a survivor of the Dewusa factory signs a lease on an apartment, opens a bank account, or watches a child graduate from an American school, they are engaging in a radical act of defiance against the man who tried to own them. These individuals carry the memories of the tin houses and the saltwater rice with them, but those memories no longer define the boundaries of their existence. They have transformed the trauma of the Ua Ngak Turnjion into a foundation of resilience that has allowed them to thrive in an environment that was once a source of terror. The T visas provided the legal architecture for this transformation. but it was the survivors' own unbreakable will that provided the spirit. Their lives today are a testament to the fact that the human capacity for renewal is far greater than any individual's capacity for cruelty, and that the promise of the American dream, one backed by the genuine protection of the law, can eventually be fulfilled for even the most marginalized among us. The figure of Quyen remains the North Star of this entire narrative, a woman whose physical sacrifice became the catalyst for a national reckoning. Her story reminds us that the fight for human rights is rarely abstract. It is written on the bodies and in the lives of those who have the courage to stand up and say no more. Her permanent blindness in one eye is a staggering, visceral reminder of what happens when a society allows greed to operate in a vacuum of oversight. Yet, her presence in the world today is not one of a victim, but of a survivor who helped to change the very laws of the country she now calls home. By testifying, she ensured that the iron pipe that stole her vision would never again be used to silence a worker under the American flag. Her legacy is one of sight, not blindness, for she forced an entire nation to open its eyes to the reality of modern slavery. Her journey from the rural provinces of Vietnam to the federal courtrooms of Hawaii and finally to a life of dignity on the mainland is a story that should be taught as a foundational text of American courage. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the Dewusa factory are more relevant than ever in our increasingly interconnected global economy. The traps of debt bondage and the exploitation of migrant labor have not vanished. They have merely moved to newer, more remote frontiers of production. The Kaibabai remains the primary tool of traffickers around the world, preying on the hopes of the poor and the indifference of the comfortable. The Dewusa case serves as a permanent warning that we must remain vigilant, that we must continue to ask the difficult questions about the origins of our goods, and that we must never allow geographical isolation to serve as a legal loophole for the violation of human dignity. It teaches us that the protection of the law must be as mobile as the capital that drives the industry, and that justice must be able to reach the furthest tin roof in the most distant territory. The silence of Tafuna has been broken, but the work of ensuring that such a silence never returns is a task that belongs to all of us as consumers, as citizens, and as members of a global community that values the life of the worker as much as the value of the work. In the final moments of this deep dive podcast series, we are left with the image of a quiet evening on the American mainland, where a survivor of the Dewusa factory sits with their family, finally free from the shadow of the barbed wire and the ache of hunger. This is the true resolution, the quiet after the storm of the FBI raid and the tension of the federal trial. The story of Dewusa is a story of profound darkness, but it is also a story of the light that follows. It is a story of a system that failed, and a system that eventually, through the courage of the survivors and the persistence of the investigators, found its way back to justice. We carry this story with us as a mandate for empathy and a shield against indifference. The names of the 200 workers may not be etched into monuments, but their legacy is etched into the very laws that protect the workers of tomorrow. They were the ones who bled for a label, but they are also the ones who proved that the human spirit cannot be manufactured, cannot be enslaved, and cannot be silenced. The narrative of Kill Suli and the Dewusa factory concludes with a simple, powerful realization that the true made in the USA label is not found on a piece of fabric, but in the commitment to the dignity and freedom of every individual who contributes to the life of the nation. The survivors of Tafuna are now part of that fabric, their strength and their stories woven into the ongoing history of a country that is always striving to be better. We thank you for listening to this deep dive into one of the most significant and heartbreaking cases in the history of American labor. As you go about your day, perhaps take a moment to look at the labels on the things you wear and remember the hands that made them. Remember the people of Dewusa, remember the courage of the strikers, and remember that in the end, it is the truth that sets us free. The silence of the island is gone, and in its place is the sound of lives being lived in the fullness of their own freedom. This is the end of the series, but it is only the beginning of the legacy of the 200 souls who turned a nightmare into a mandate for a more just and compassionate world. We leave this story here, In the quiet of a life reclaimed, with the knowledge that while we cannot change the horrors of the past, we can absolutely ensure they are never repeated in the dark. The ghost of the DeWusa factory serves as a sentinel, a permanent reminder to watch over the vulnerable and to demand accountability from the powerful. The workers of Tufuna were once invisible, but they are invisible no more. They are heard, they are seen, and they are home. This is the final word on the DeWusa tragedy, a story of the resilience of the human soul and the inevitable, unyielding pursuit of justice across the vast expanse of the Pacific. To the survivors, we our deepest respect. To the traffickers, we promise our constant vigilance. And to our listeners, we offer this story as a call to action. Never stop looking, never stop asking, and never stop believing that even in the most absolute darkness, the light of human rights will eventually find its way through the cracks. This has been a true crime deep dive into the shadows of the Made in USA label and the incredible people who walked out of those shadows into the light of their own freedom.